Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Now let's begin with story 1. The Barber-surgeons toolkit, bloodletting and battlefield wounds. You're walking down a muddy street in a medieval European town, say, around the year 1250. There are pigs wandering freely, food scraps discarded into the gutters, and the distant sound of a blacksmith hammering iron. But amid the din of daily life, your eyes catch a sign, a red and white pole spinning slowly outside a small, dark shop. This is the home of the barber-surgeon. You might think of barbers today as genteel professionals who trim beards and style hair. In the Middle Ages, though, they were something far more versatile and dangerous. In a world where university-trained physicians were rare, expensive, and more interested in reading Galenic texts than touching patients, barber-surgeons stepped in to meet the practical needs of the people. They wielded razors and bone saws alike. A hybrid profession, haircuts and amputations. The barber-surgeon was part craftsman, part healer. The dual role came out of practicality. Hair cutting required razors. Shaving razors were sharp. And where there were sharp tools, there were also accidents, infections, and the occasional opportunity to help someone in need of a more serious incision. Barbers were not formally educated in the way university-trained physicians were. They didn't speak Latin or spend time contemplating the four humors in dusty halls of learning. Instead, they learned through apprenticeship, passed down knowledge from master to student. Their education was hands-on, grimy, and full of trial and error. Imagine your first day as a barber-surgeon's apprentice. No sterilization, no gloves, and a heavy reliance on instinct, routine, and superstition. The smells alone, iron, blood, unwashed bodies, rot would stay with you for life. Bloodletting and the four humors. One of the barber-surgeon's most important duties was bloodletting, a central medical treatment of the time. This wasn't done randomly, it was part of the larger belief system of humoral theory. According to Galen and Hippocrates, the human body was governed by four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness, they believed, came from an imbalance in these humors. If someone had a fever, they were thought to have too much blood. If they were melancholic, too much black bile. Treatments sought to restore equilibrium not necessarily by curing the underlying disease, but by adjusting the body's fluids to bring back balance. And so out came the lancet. Barber-surgeons would cut veins in the arm, neck, or behind the ear, allowing blood to flow freely into a basin. The volume could vary. Some practitioners aimed for a few ounces, others drew pints. Patients might become dizzy or collapse. In extreme cases, they could die, but if the patient improved, the surgeon was praised. If they worsened, it was the will of God or an unfortunate imbalance too advanced to fix. The iconic red and white barber pole comes from this practice. The red represents blood, the white bandages. The pole itself. Patients were asked to grasp a wooden stick and squeeze during the procedure to make the veins stand out. Tools of the trade. The barber-surgeon's toolkit was brutally efficient. It included razors and lancets for bloodletting, bone saws for amputations, forceps for tooth extraction, needles and catgut for stitching, cautery irons heated to glowing red for sealing wounds. Most of these tools were cleaned only by wiping them down. Sterilization wasn't understood. Infection was a frequent companion. Even so, in the absence of alternatives, these practitioners became a mainstay of medieval medical care. One notable innovation was the use of cautery, burning the flesh to stop bleeding or close a wound. The pain was excruciating. No anesthesia was available beyond alcohol, opium, or a hard bite on a leather strap. Still, patients would return, because the barber-surgeon offered something few others could: action. On the battlefield, barber-surgeons were especially critical in military settings. After battles, they moved among the wounded, treating deep gashes, arrow wounds, and crushed limbs. Amputations were common. A crushed leg with broken bone often led to infection. If gangrene set in, amputation was the only option, done quickly, with assistance to hold the patient down. Recovery was uncertain. Death from shock, blood loss, or sepsis was always a risk, yet some lived, healed, and even returned to fight. There are records of barber-surgeons during the Crusades, during the 100 Years' War, and in various skirmishes across Europe. Their battlefield work, though harrowing, helped lay the groundwork for surgical procedure and battlefield medicine in centuries to come. Regulation and recognition. As barber-surgeons became more important, guilds began to form. In 1540, long after the period we're describing, King Henry VIII united the Company of Barbers and the Company of Surgeons into the Company of Barber-surgeons in England. But even in the earlier medieval centuries, some cities tried to regulate them. Licensing varied wildly. In Paris, barber-surgeons were divided into those who could perform surgery and those who could only shave and bleed. In rural areas, however, such distinctions were often meaningless. The local barber might be the only person within 100 miles who had any idea how to set a broken bone or drain an abscess. Yet despite their importance, barber-surgeons were often viewed as inferior to university-educated physicians. Physicians rarely touched their patients, they prescribed and observed. Barber-surgeons, on the other hand, did the work and bore the blame when it failed. A culture of pain. In many ways, being treated by a barber-surgeon was a test of will. Pain was part of the process. There were no antiseptics, no antibiotics, no understanding of germ theory. A wound could fester. Pus was sometimes seen as a good sign, laudable pus. It was believed to indicate that the body was expelling the disease. And yet people survived. Some wounds healed. Scarred, yes. Crippled, often. But alive. Human resilience combined with just enough knowledge and a lot of courage made this possible. For the barber-surgeon, there was always more to learn. Each patient was an experiment. Each wound a puzzle. They listened, observed, and passed down what worked. But one might ask, how did they treat infections when the tools were unclean, the air foul, and knowledge so limited? That's how many stories began in the medieval world. A scrape from a plow, a cut from a sword that barely broke the skin, a thorn embedded in the palm during harvest. In a time when bacteria were unknown and antisepsis was centuries away, any breach in the skin was a potential death sentence. You, perhaps a peasant, soldier, or tradesman, might think little of it at first, but within days the pain deepens. The wound becomes hot, swollen, angry, pus oozes, fever sets in. Your neighbors speak of bad humors or a rotting spirit. You are taken to the barber-surgeon. And here begins the real work of infection treatment, such as it was. Understanding infection before germ theory. The medieval understanding of infection was profoundly limited. Disease was not attributed to microscopic pathogens, but to divine punishment, bad air, miasma, or internal imbalance. A festering wound was not the result of bacteria invading tissue, but a sign that the body was attempting to purge corruption. Despite this, many barber-surgeons and healers made keen observations. They saw that some wounds healed and others did not. They noticed patterns. Wounds packed with moss healed better. Those left open to the air often worsened. They couldn't explain why, but experience taught them what sometimes worked. Still, lacking the framework to understand contagion or sterilization, their treatments often walked a fine line between help and harm. Common treatments for infected wounds. Barber-surgeons employed a range of interventions, some effective, others less so. Here are a few. 1. Poultices and plasters. Poultices made from herbs, honey, animal fat, or bread were placed on infected wounds. Honey, though its benefits were not scientifically understood, was occasionally used and did have natural antibacterial properties. Herbs like comfrey, yarrow, and plantain were used for their soothing or drying effects. A typical recipe might involve soaking a cloth in wine or vinegar, believed to purify, applying mashed herbs, and binding the wound tightly. Sometimes animal dung was added, particularly goose or cow dung mixed with lard or wine. While this sounds horrific to modern ears, it was based on the observation that some dung treatments seemed to draw out infection. Of course, more often than not, it introduced further contamination. 2. Cauterization. For serious infections, especially when tissue began to die or rot, the preferred method was cauterization. The infected area was burned with a red-hot iron. The pain was unimaginable. The patient was held down, perhaps given a draught of wine, or knocked out with a blow to the head if lucky. Cauterization served two purposes: to seal bleeding and to destroy the diseased flesh. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the wound festered worse than before. 3. Lancing abscesses. An abscess was considered a store of bad humors that needed to be expelled. A sharp blade would be used to cut it open, often without cleaning the surrounding skin. The resulting pus was, paradoxically, welcomed, especially if it was thick and white, the so-called laudable pus. This, healers believed, was a sign of the body purging itself properly. In reality, the presence of pus often indicated a dangerous bacterial infection, but it was seen as positive evidence that the treatment was working. 4. Amputation. When infection spread, when the wound blackened, foul odors emerged, and flesh turned cold, amputation was the last resort. The operation had to be done quickly. Assistants restrained the patient. The surgeon tied a tourniquet above the limb, cut quickly with a knife or saw, then cauterized the stump to stop bleeding. Survival rates were low, but for those who lived, it was often the only way to prevent certain death from spreading infection. Magical thinking meets practical action. In many cases, treatment combined physical remedies with spiritual interventions. A barber-surgeon might make the sign of the cross before cutting. Prayers were whispered over wounds. Some wounds were treated with relics, bones of saints, holy water, or pilgrimages to sacred springs. Yet within the framework of medieval beliefs, even these rituals served a purpose. Healing was holistic, of the body and the soul. Suffering had meaning. Pain was part of purification. This interplay of faith and medicine created a system where the practical and the mystical coexisted, often in the same room. A barber-surgeon might drain an abscess in the morning and attend a healing mass in the evening. Accidental innovations and moments of genius. Despite their limited tools and flawed theories, medieval healers occasionally stumbled upon remarkably effective practices. Wine and vinegar as antiseptics. Some barber-surgeons cleaned wounds with wine. While this was seen as a way to remove visible filth, we now know alcohol has mild antiseptic properties. Using wine was, in fact, better than using water in many cases. Vinegar, too, was applied to wounds and instruments. Its acidity helped kill some bacteria. Clean bandaging. Certain surgical manuals, such as The Practice of Surgery by Henry de Monville, early 14th century, advised the use of clean linen and described methods to prevent the recontamination of wounds. De Monville even noted that laudable pus was not always desirable, a bold contradiction of the prevailing belief. Herbal wisdom. Folk remedies often preserved ancient knowledge. Garlic and onion, for example, were used in some wound treatments, and both have antimicrobial properties. In fact, a recreated 10th century Anglo-Saxon remedy for eye infections, Bald's Leech Book, was found in modern studies to be effective against Staphylococcus aureus, MRSA. These moments of effectiveness were not systematized, and few understood why something worked, but they hint at a body of observational knowledge growing slowly across centuries. Survival in the aftermath. For those who survived an infected wound, the road ahead was long. There was no physical therapy, no antibiotics, no prosthetics beyond carved wooden limbs or leather straps. Scars were common. Disability, too. Many survivors were disfigured or left with limited mobility, but to live when so many died was a triumph. Veterans of war might return home with missing arms or legs, becoming living evidence of both suffering and resilience. Some towns supported them with small pensions. Others relied on the charity of their community or the church. In some cases, a man with an amputated hand might become a healer himself, passing on what he'd learned through pain. The hidden costs of infection. Infection was a quiet killer. It claimed lives without fanfare, especially during peacetime. Women could die from childbirth infections. Children succumbed to infected cuts or animal bites. Workers were maimed from infected splinters or wounds from tools. Medical literature focused on major injuries, sword wounds, battle trauma, but the average person was more likely to be undone by a simple cut while working. And this is what makes medieval first aid so poignant. For all its limitations, it emerged from the sheer necessity of survival. Every attempt to treat infection, however misguided, was a small act of resistance against death. Still, one cannot help but wonder. What happened when formal medicine failed completely, when infection turned to plague, and healing required not just a surgeon, but a miracle? The year is 1453. The last stronghold of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople, has fallen. Gunpowder is changing the face of warfare, and with every cannon blast, every musket shot, comes new types of wounds, jagged, burning, unfamiliar. The barber-surgeon stands once again at the edge of the battlefield. His leather apron is soaked with blood, his tools still dull from overuse. He wipes them on his tunic and prepares for the next operation, knowing that some of his patients won't survive the night. But slowly, very slowly, change is in the air. The turning point, gunpowder and a crisis of methods. With the rise of firearms in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, surgeons faced an urgent dilemma: how to treat gunshot wounds. The traditional method was cauterization, pouring boiling oil into the wound to cleanse it and seal the tissues. The French barber-surgeon Ambroise Paré in the 1530s found himself short of oil one day during a battle. In desperation, he created a gentler alternative, a mixture of egg yolk, oil of roses, and turpentine. He applied this salve to the wounds instead. To his surprise, patients treated with the salve were calmer, slept through the night, and their wounds healed better. It was a revelation. Paré's discovery was a small rebellion against entrenched methods. He would go on to challenge cauterization, reintroduce ligatures, tying arteries rather than burning them, and emphasize observation and kindness in patient care, something rare in his era. Though Paré came slightly after the medieval barber-surgeon's peak, his work emerged directly from their world. He began his career not as a physician but as a barber-surgeon apprentice, learning by doing. Guilds and the slow rise of surgical respectability. By the late Middle Ages, barber-surgeons had formed powerful guilds in many European cities. These organizations regulated training, enforced standards where possible, and offered a modest sense of professional identity. In England, the Barber-surgeons' Company was officially created in 1540, uniting two rival groups under royal charter. Their coat of arms depicted a bowl of blood, a razor, and surgical tools, honoring both sides of their profession. However, the relationship between barber-surgeons and academic physicians remained strained. Surgeons were still seen as manual laborers, craftsmen of flesh. Physicians, by contrast, were men of letters who consulted tomes, not patients. But surgery was changing. Anatomy was returning to the fore. Dissections once forbidden by the church were being quietly conducted in universities and sometimes even public theaters. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci studied the human body with intense fascination, drawing muscles, bones, and organs with startling accuracy. The human body was becoming a subject of study, not just suffering. Barber or surgeon, a gradual division. As the Renaissance bloomed, the roles of barbers and surgeons slowly split. In major cities, barbers began to focus more on grooming and bloodletting, while surgery became increasingly professionalized. By the 18th century, the separation was largely complete. Surgeons formed their own colleges, demanded licenses, and pursued formal education. Barbers returned to the role we now recognize, cutting hair and shaving beards. But in rural areas, the change was slower. Even into the 1800s, a country barber might still be called upon to lance boils, pull teeth, or stitch a gash. The legacy of the barber-surgeon lingered. Lessons in pain, adaptation, and resilience. What can we say about this grim profession? The barber-surgeon was never a scientist, not in the modern sense. He operated with flawed theories, dull tools, and superstition. His methods were crude, often painful, and sometimes fatal. Yet he was there when no one else would be. He did the cutting when it was needed. He cleaned wounds, however imperfectly. He drained the abscess, removed the splinter, amputated the gangrenous limb. And in doing so, he gave people a fighting chance. It was messy work, undignified and vital. These men, and sometimes women, lived at the intersection of necessity and ignorance, slowly carving a path bloody, hesitant, and incomplete toward what we now call medicine. They kept records, trained apprentices, and passed down empirical knowledge. And in the most harrowing of circumstances, on muddy battlefields, in plague-stricken villages, in torchlit sheds, they practiced the oldest form of medicine, doing something, anything, to save a life. The echoes of the barber-surgeon today. Modern surgery is sterile, precise, and bound by regulations. But in every scalpel and suture, every emergency operation, there's an echo of the barber-surgeon. The red and white barber pole remains, a silent tribute to the blood and bandages of a profession that once stood between life and death. And as we consider their legacy, perhaps we're left with a question. When the tools are limited and knowledge uncertain, what drives someone to reach into a wound and try to heal? Story 2. Pus, prayer, and penance. Healing in the monasteries. It is a quiet morning in the year 1147. The bell tolls softly from the cloister tower, echoing across a landscape of silence and stillness. You walk slowly through a walled stone corridor where the air smells of beeswax, musty manuscripts, and incense. Light filters through arched windows, casting long rays across the cold stone floor. In the distance, a monk in a brown robe tends to a patient, his hands gentle, his movements slow, deliberate, and calm. You've entered the world of the medieval monastic infirmary. While barber-surgeons labored in towns and on battlefields, monasteries offered another form of care, spiritual, regimented, and deeply entwined with religious doctrine. Here, healing was not just of the body but of the soul. And in these quiet walls, monks practiced some of the most advanced and methodical medical care available in medieval Europe. The infirmary, healing within holy walls. Monastic infirmaries were often tucked away in a separate wing of the monastery, away from the bustle of scriptoriums, chapels, and refectories. The layout was intentional, quiet, light-filled rooms for recovery, an herb garden nearby, and a steady rhythm of prayer and care. Not all patients were monks. Many monasteries, especially Benedictine houses, accepted laypeople, the poor, the sick, pilgrims, and travelers. Hospitality was seen as a sacred duty, and so even the peasant with a festering leg wound might find himself treated with bandages and prayer within these holy walls. The infirmary, a monk assigned to oversee care, held both spiritual and practical authority. He administered treatments, distributed food, and ensured cleanliness to the extent it was understood. Though the church didn't condone surgery in most cases, and priests were discouraged from shedding blood, these monasteries provided some of the most systematic care of the time. A philosophy of healing. Healing in the monastic worldview was closely tied to sin and morality. Illness was seen as a trial, perhaps punishment for sin, or a test of faith. Prayer, confession, and acts of penance were integral to any treatment plan. But this didn't mean physical care was ignored. Monastic medicine was based on a mixture of Galenic and Hippocratic texts, preserved through copying and study, biblical interpretation, folk knowledge and herb lore, observation and routine care. Monks were among the few literate men in Europe. Many had access to ancient Greek and Roman texts, translated into Latin, that had been lost elsewhere. In this way, they served as guardians of classical medical knowledge. Monasteries became both repositories and laboratories, quiet centers, where healing theory met daily practice. Daily life in the infirmary. If you were a patient in a monastery infirmary, your experience would be structured, calm, and slow. You would rise at dawn to the sound of bells. Meals would be simple: broth, bread, wine, and herbs. Prayers would be said over your bed. Your bandages would be changed by the infirmer or a novice. You might be given herbal preparations, teas, powders, salves. And every day, your condition would be recorded in a modest but methodical way. Clean linens were a luxury, but in monasteries they were often more common than in towns. Cleanliness was valued if not entirely understood. Monks would bathe patients, sometimes with herbal infusions, comb hair, and burn incense to ward off bad air. Pain relief was limited, but poppy, henbane, and hemlock were known and used carefully. Above all, there was time, no rushing, no payment required, no punishment for poverty. The herb garden, the pharmacy of the faithful. Perhaps the most iconic part of monastic medicine was the herb garden. Every well-established monastery maintained a hortus medicus, a medicinal garden filled with plants thought to heal. This was the monastery's pharmacy, cultivated with reverence and care. Some of the herbs you'd find include wormwood for digestion and parasites, chamomile for fever and relaxation, sage considered a cure-all. Why should a man die who has sage in his garden? Comfrey for broken bones and bruises, fennel for indigestion, valerian for sleep, yarrow for wound healing. These herbs were dried, ground, infused, or brewed into decoctions. Monks kept recipe books, some of which still survive, containing hundreds of remedies, often with detailed instructions. The knowledge came from Greek texts, Roman field medicine, Arabic medical manuscripts, and centuries of oral tradition. The Book of Healing, Manuscripts and Medicine. Within the monastery's library, large manuscripts lay on wooden desks open to pages of Latin script, diagrams of the human body, and lists of symptoms and treatments. These were not fanciful books but working texts, practical, organized, and treasured. One such text was the Herbarium of Apuleius, a Latin guide to medicinal plants that circulated widely. Another was Bald's Leech Book, compiled in Anglo-Saxon England, blending folk remedies with Christian invocation. In many monasteries, the infirmer copied, translated, and annotated these works, adding his own experiences at the margins. Thus, each infirmary was not only a site of healing but of knowledge creation. Even without microscopes or scientific method, monks were observing patterns, tracking recovery, and preserving what worked. A gentle, structured kind of care. Compared to the chaos of battlefield surgery or the superstition of folk remedies, monastic care was gentle, methodical, and surprisingly modern in its structure. Patients were housed in clean beds. Care was consistent and daily. Herbs were grown, prepared, and administered carefully. Records were kept, and the soul was not forgotten. Yet this care had its limits. Monks rarely performed invasive surgery. They were more comfortable treating fevers, swellings, and ulcers than setting bones or amputating limbs. For those cases, outside help often from a passing barber surgeon might be sought. Still, many patients recovered. Whether by rest, diet, or faith, they left the monastery healthier than when they entered. But what happened when the care of the monastery met the chaos of plague, or when healing clashed with accusations of heresy? What if prayer was no longer enough? It is the summer of 1348. The monastery walls stand still under a brooding sky. The garden lies overgrown, the chapel eerily quiet. Inside the infirmary, the smell of incense struggles to mask the stench of sweat, blood, and decay. One monk lies dying, 2 others cough quietly in their cells, and the infirmary works without rest. The plague has arrived. This was not a time of routine healing. The rules of order, rhythm, and gentle recovery were shattered. In monasteries across Europe, the Black Death tested every principle the monastic healers had clung to and exposed the limits of both medicine and faith. The crisis of the Black Death. When the bubonic plague swept across Europe between 1347 and 1351, it didn't spare monasteries. In fact, it hit them particularly hard. Monks lived in close quarters, shared food and space, and practiced hospitality, welcoming strangers who might carry the very disease they feared. Their vows of obedience and service meant they could not easily flee, and many refused to, choosing instead to care for the sick and die with them. The mortality rate among monks and nuns was staggering. Entire communities vanished. Some abbeys were depopulated entirely. The rulebooks were silent on what to do when half the brethren were dead. Medical knowledge was overwhelmed. The symptoms black boils, fever, vomiting, and swift death did not fit neatly into Galenic theory. The humors had no answer for this. Was it miasma, divine punishment, an astrological alignment? The explanations varied, but the fear was constant. Rituals in a time of powerlessness. In the face of crisis, monasteries leaned even more heavily into spiritual healing. Prayers and masses for the sick increased. Flagellant processions, though often outside formal monasteries, called for penance and public acts of suffering to cleanse the world. Relics were brought out and paraded. Saints associated with healing, like St. Sebastian or St. Roch, were invoked again and again. But the plague continued, and each death left fewer monks to copy texts, tend to patients, or even ring the chapel bell. Some monasteries turned inward, refusing visitors. Others dissolved entirely. But a few, remarkably, became centers of plague response, stockpiling herbal remedies, experimenting with isolation, and documenting symptoms. This was not medicine as it had been, nor quite as it would become. It was care in extremity stripped down, spiritual, desperate. Healing and heresy, when folk knowledge crossed lines. Beyond the plague, another threat loomed, this one not to the body, but to the authority of the church. As monasteries engaged in healing, they often absorbed local practices. In rural areas, monastic herb gardens were informed by local women midwives, wise women, herbalists. These women preserved plant knowledge, seasonal cycles, and treatments that monks quietly adopted into their routines. But tension simmered. The church grew wary of those who healed outside of its doctrine. Women who practiced healing were sometimes labeled heretics or witches, especially if they refused to submit to male or clerical authority. In some cases, monasteries protected local healers, recognizing their skill and need. In others, they denounced them, feeding into broader campaigns of persecution. Thus, healing in the monastic world was not only about curing the body, it was about controlling the narrative of health. Who had the right to heal? Who could be trusted? Whose knowledge was legitimate? Medicine and morality, sin as sickness. Monastic healing always carried a moral weight. Illness, especially chronic or disfiguring illness, was often seen as a symptom of spiritual failing. A man with leprosy might be viewed as cursed or morally unclean. A woman with seizures could be suspected of demonic possession. Even those with fevers were encouraged to confess, lest the illness be their punishment. This belief created a two-part system of care: spiritual treatment, confession, prayer, penance, sometimes flagellation; physical remedies, herbs, bathing, isolation, or bleeding, less common in monasteries than among Barber-surgeons. But while this view imposed guilt, it also offered hope. Healing the soul could lead to healing the body. Suffering could have meaning. And sometimes through care, rest, and mild herbal treatments, people did get better. Monasteries became known not just for prayers, but for results. Beyond Europe, influence from the Islamic world. One reason monastic medicine advanced was its preservation of ancient knowledge, and much of this came through the Islamic world. Arabic medical texts, such as those by Avicenna, Ibn Sina, and Al-Razi, were translated into Latin and found their way into monastic libraries. These works emphasized observation, hygiene, and systematic classification of disease. Monks integrated this knowledge, sometimes without attribution, into their own practices. This blend of Galenic, Arabic, and folk knowledge shaped a hybrid approach to healing, one that was more informed than many imagine. A fragile system under strain. By the late 14th and early 15th centuries, the monastic medical model was under strain. The Black Death had decimated monastic populations. Universities were rising, producing secular physicians trained in theory. Cities began to establish public hospitals funded by merchants and secular authorities. The church itself faced internal crises, from the Western Schism to growing calls for reform. Monasteries still offered healing, but they were no longer the only centers of care. Their influence waned, their methods scrutinized. Yet in rural areas, the monastery remained vital. The poor still sought sanctuary there. The sick still knocked on the door. And within those cloistered walls, the legacy of centuries of quiet, structured healing continued. But the world was changing. The question now was, would the monastery adapt to a world of universities, science, and secular hospitals, or would it retreat into history? It is the early 16th century. The printing press hums in distant cities, its movable type slowly transforming the pace and shape of knowledge. Renaissance thinkers dissect cadavers and challenge old texts. The old world is stirring, stretching awake, and in the hills, nestled behind ancient stone walls, the monasteries still tend their gardens. The world is changing, but the monks continue to heal. Even as universities rise, surgery evolves, and cities grow crowded with new public hospitals, the quiet medical work of monastic communities carries on, sometimes overlooked, sometimes dismissed, but never quite forgotten. From scriptoriums to pharmacies. While physicians and scholars argued over Aristotle and Galen in crowded lecture halls, monasteries remained the custodians of continuity. They had preserved, copied, and translated medical texts through centuries of instability. Now, with the printing press, these texts could finally circulate beyond their cloistered walls. The best-known example of this enduring influence may be found in the Scuola Medica Salernitana, or the Salerno Medical School in southern Italy. Though not a monastery per se, it evolved from a Benedictine monastic setting and drew heavily on monastic knowledge and scriptural traditions. By the 12th century, it had become one of the first institutions in Europe to combine monastic care with formal education. Even in northern monasteries, monks continued their botanical experiments, expanded herb gardens, and compiled new books of remedies. These weren't just dusty tomes of superstition. They were practical, annotated records of centuries of trial and error. This transfer of knowledge, quiet and gradual, helped lay the groundwork for early pharmacology. Hospitals with a cross and a garden. One lasting contribution of monastic healing was the hospital model. By the late Middle Ages, many monasteries had developed formal hospital facilities primitive by modern standards, but organized around key principles that still resonate today. Clean bedding and food. Structured care and record keeping. Emphasis on rest and observation. Treatment regardless of wealth. Though initially limited to pilgrims and the faithful, these hospitals gradually opened to broader populations. Some towns even adopted the monastic model, establishing hospitals funded by guilds, merchants, or nobles, but structured like monastic infirmaries with gardens, chapels, and wardens. This transition marked a crucial shift, from purely spiritual sanctuaries to civic institutions of health, a bridge to modern medicine. It would be easy to dismiss monastic medicine as archaic, a patchwork of herbs and prayers, but to do so would overlook its essential role as a bridge between classical antiquity and early modern science. The monks preserved Hippocratic and Galenic texts during centuries when war, plague, and political chaos threatened their extinction, maintained herbal knowledge, some of which we now know to be medically valid, created systems of documentation and patient care that would influence future hospital models, offered free care long before public health systems existed, and developed healing as a practice of ritual, routine, and observation, however constrained by theology. In their way, they were scientists of stability working with limited tools, resisting chaos, and holding together what they could of the healing arts. The Reformation and the decline of monastic healing. In the 16th century, however, the Reformation brought profound changes. Across much of northern Europe, monasteries were dissolved, their lands confiscated, their libraries scattered or burned. In England, for instance, Henry VII's dissolution of the monasteries between 1536 and 1541 ended centuries of monastic health care. Some infirmaries were repurposed into secular hospitals. Others were simply destroyed. This marked the end of monastic medicine as a central institution. Healing moved into secular hands: physicians, barber-surgeons, apothecaries, and eventually, state-funded hospitals. And yet, even as the monastic model faded from the physical landscape, its influence lingered. Every time a hospital was built around a garden, a pharmacy classified its herbal stocks, or a nurse administered care with patience and reverence, something of the monastery lived on, a legacy etched in stone and silence. Today, many former monasteries lie in ruins or serve as tourist sites. Their infirmaries are empty. Their herb gardens, if preserved at all, are now curated by historians. But if you visit one, you may still feel it, that deep stillness, the echo of order, the gentle rhythm of bells and footfalls. In those stone halls, ordinary monks once held the line between sickness and death, offering care not for fame or money, but out of duty and belief. They knew that healing was not always possible, that many would die, that knowledge was incomplete, but they practiced anyway. They changed bandages, boiled herbs, whispered prayers, recorded outcomes, watched, waited, hoped. And in doing so, they laid the quiet foundation of care. So the next time you walk through the sterile corridors of a hospital or fill a prescription at a modern pharmacy, you might pause and wonder, how much of this came from hands long buried, tending to fevered strangers behind monastery walls? Story 3. Leeches and lances, commoners' remedies in the villages. It is a cool morning in the year 1322. The fields stretch wide and low, heavy with early mist. In the small village of Thornwick, somewhere in the English countryside, the blacksmith's daughter winces as she steps outside, clutching her swollen wrist. Her mother mutters a quiet prayer under her breath. There is no physician here, no monastery, no town barber. Instead, they call for Edith, a gray-haired woman known in whispers as the wise wife. She is not learned. She owns no Latin books, but the village trusts her. She's treated fevers, eased births, and even removed a splinter from the reeve's eye with her own hands. This is not the story of kings or battlefields. It's the story of medicine among the ordinary, those who lived and died in dirt-floored cottages, far from libraries, hospitals, and surgical halls. It is a story of practical healing, inherited knowledge, and survival with next to nothing. The absence of doctors. Physicians in the medieval world were a rare and elite class. Most were educated in universities in cities like Paris, Bologna, or Oxford. They spoke Latin, read Galen and Avicenna, and often served the wealthy or noble families. For the average villager, however, the idea of calling a university physician was unthinkable both logistically and financially. A single consultation could cost more than a month's income, and even if one were summoned, the advice might be no more helpful than what was already known: rest, prayer, and purging. So people turned to their own. The village healer, midwives, herbwives, and cunning folk. Every village had its healer, though the name and role varied. The wise woman or man, often elderly with decades of experience. She offered poultices, teas, and charms. The midwife, a crucial figure not just for childbirth, but for treating women's ailments. The bone setter, usually a man with practical experience in fixing dislocations and fractures. The cunning folk, those who offered charms, spells, or magical protections alongside physical remedies. These roles were not formalized but earned through reputation and experience. Healing knowledge passed orally, generation to generation. Remedies were memorized, not written down. Children observed their elders, helping gather herbs or prepare poultices. And in many cases, they worked. Herbal remedies and the lay pharmacopoeia. The foundation of common healing was the herb garden and the hedgerow. Plants were medicine collected with care, stored in jars or tied in bundles, and used in complex combinations. Here are a few examples of remedies known in the villages. Yarrow, applied to wounds to stop bleeding. Marigold calendula, infused in oils for cuts and skin infections. Nettle, used in poultices for joint pain or inflammation. Garlic, consumed raw or mixed into salves for its hot properties. Onion and honey, mashed into pastes for chest congestion or infected wounds. Leeches, applied to reduce swelling or draw bad blood from an area. Wormwood tea, given for intestinal worms or digestive distress. These remedies came from a combination of local knowledge, long oral traditions, and a rough understanding of humoral theory, the belief that illness came from imbalances of hot, cold, wet, and dry. Even without Latin texts, village healers often understood how to cool a fever or dry a weeping sore. Their language was different, but the underlying logic was not so far removed from the universities. Tools of the common healer. Without metal instruments or fine glassware, village healers relied on simple tools. Knives and needles, often repurposed household items. Wooden splints and bindings, made from willow or cloth soaked in vinegar. Clay pots and pans, used to brew herbal infusions or decoctions. Hollow reeds or bones, occasionally used for draining abscesses or drawing fluids. Hands for setting bones, checking pulses, or massaging cramped muscles. One widely used method was sweating, bundling a sick person in blankets near a fire, giving them hot herb teas, and waiting for the fever to break. Another was fumigation, burning certain herbs to cleanse the air of sickness. While not scientific by modern standards, some of these methods worked. Sweating could help reduce fever. Fumigation might repel lice or pests, and many herbal compounds did have real pharmacological effects. Sickness and the natural world. For village people, the body was part of the natural world, and so were disease and health. The seasons, the moon, the weather, the animals all played a part in health. People believed illness might come with the east wind or after a bad harvest. Certain herbs were only potent when picked at sunrise. Water from a particular spring could heal, but only if drawn before dawn. Healing, then, was not just practical, it was also ritualistic. Charms might be spoken aloud while administering a remedy. Crosses were drawn over wounds. Folk prayers were whispered during childbirth. Faith and medicine were intertwined, not because people were ignorant, but because they lived in a world where everything was connected: body, spirit, land, and sky. Childbirth, injury, and infection. The most common medical crises in village life were childbirth, often dangerous, especially for first-time mothers. Midwives helped with positioning, herbal painkillers like poppy or belladonna, and postnatal care. Injury, cuts from farming tools, crushed fingers, broken limbs, all common. Bone setters had a mix of success and failure. Infections, especially dangerous. A small wound could turn fatal. Honey, vinegar, and garlic were often used to prevent worsening. Toothaches, a source of constant misery. Remedies ranged from poultices to outright removal with forceps or pliers. Fevers, treated with teas, cool compresses, and isolation when possible. In many cases, care focused on comfort and observation, a level of attentiveness often missing in more formal settings. But there were limits. No antibiotics, no anesthesia, no transfusions. Death was never far away. And when healing failed, the healer turned to something older than medicine: the community's collective memory. They buried the dead, marked the grave, remembered the remedy, and moved on. Suspicion and trust, the healer on the edge. Village healers walked a delicate line. They were respected but also feared. If a treatment failed or if someone died under their care, they could be accused of witchcraft or sorcery, especially in later centuries. Women were particularly vulnerable to such accusations. Still, most villagers trusted their healer far more than they did any distant, Latin-speaking physician. The healer knew their names, had seen their children born, had treated their sores and fevers with a gentleness shaped by long familiarity. The healer wasn't just a medical figure. They were a pillar of continuity in a world where life was short and uncertain. But what happened when the village's remedies failed? When disease came not from a wound or weather, but from elsewhere sweeping across the land, unrelenting, immune to nettle or leech? Could the common people survive the plagues and poxes that even monasteries feared? The year is now 1360. The sky over the village is heavy with low clouds. Smoke curls lazily from a few chimneys, but the fields lie fallow, the streets eerily quiet. Inside one hut, a man lies in his straw bed, covered in sweat, his breathing shallow. Outside, no one knocks. No one comes. The people remember what happened last time: the fever, the swellings, the quick deaths. The plague has returned. For the common folk of medieval Europe, illness was a constant part of life. But when disease came not as a familiar fever or wound, but as something vast, something that swept across entire regions, emptied villages, and left no cure behind, healing became not just a question of herbs or poultices, but of faith, fear, and endurance. The Black Death in the villages. When the Black Death first struck in 1347, it traveled with terrifying speed. Towns and cities were hit hardest, but the countryside was not spared. Some rural areas were entirely depopulated. Others lost half their people. And with the dead went the healers, the wise women, the midwives, the only ones who knew which herbs to use and when to pick them. Villagers tried everything: burning herbs in homes and barns, hanging bunches of garlic and juniper in doorways, fasting and praying, fleeing, though where could one flee when the disease was everywhere? The cause of the plague was not understood. Some blamed the stars, others suspected poisoned wells. Many believed it was God's punishment and that healing could come only through repentance. And yet, even amid terror, some treatments persisted. Villagers turned to old knowledge: wormwood to keep away bad air, vinegar-soaked cloths for cleansing, dried rose petals to sweeten the air of the sick room. It wasn't enough, but it was something action in the face of despair. Superstition, magic, and the blurred line between healing and belief. In a world with little scientific grounding, superstition was woven tightly into medicine, not because people were foolish, but because they lived in a world full of mystery and danger. To the villagers, there were forces beyond understanding: spirits, demons, curses, and divine punishment. A healer might recite a charm while applying a poultice, use an amulet or talisman to ward off illness, offer a special herbal infusion during specific moon phases, whisper a protection spell into a sick child's ear. These actions weren't always considered magic in a negative sense. They were part of the cultural logic of the time, blending healing with protection, prayer with practice. But in times of fear, suspicion grew. As plagues returned and crops failed, those who dealt with unseen forces became targets. The witch hunts begin. By the 15th century, especially in parts of Central and Western Europe, a darker suspicion crept into village life. Women, particularly older women who knew how to treat illness, deliver babies, or interpret dreams, were increasingly accused of witchcraft. The line between healer and heretic blurred. A failed remedy, a stillbirth, a mysterious death, any of these could turn a once respected herb wife into an outcast or worse. Accusations were often vague, built on envy, fear, or personal grudges, and they had devastating consequences. Though not all regions engaged in widespread witch hunts, many villages saw at least one healer dragged before a local lord or ecclesiastical court. Still, in most communities, healing persisted. The villagers could not afford to lose their cunning folk, even if they feared them. And so, many continued to visit them quietly after nightfall, or in hushed whispers at the edge of a field. Healing in isolation. As villages grew more isolated, whether due to plague, war, or harsh seasons, self-reliance became even more essential. Each household developed its own modest pharmacy. Dried mint for stomach aches, lard mixed with beeswax for burns, garlic soaked in vinegar for infection, poppy seeds sewn into sachets for sleep. Children learned by watching their mothers and grandmothers. They helped pick herbs in summer and bundle them for winter. Illness became a family affair, managed with care and fear in equal measure. Midwives continued to attend births, often traveling great distances. Bone setters were called when a child fell from a tree or a cart overturned, and the memory of what had worked and what had failed was passed on through stories, not books. This oral tradition formed the unwritten medical history of common Europe. Folk remedies and the foundations of modern medicine. Though many medieval village remedies were eventually abandoned or replaced, some persisted, and with good reason. Honey, used in wound care, is now recognized for its antibacterial properties. Garlic has proven antibiotic effects. Willow bark, chewed for pain relief, contains salicin, the chemical precursor to aspirin. Yarrow, used to stop bleeding, does indeed contain compounds that aid clotting. Even leeches, long mocked as medieval quackery, are still used in modern microsurgery to reduce blood pooling and promote healing. In this way, the folk healers of the Middle Ages, though they lacked theory, had something just as powerful: observation. They watched what worked, they remembered, and they kept people alive as best they could. Their methods were often dismissed by university physicians, but those physicians rarely entered the homes of the poor. It was the wise woman, the midwife, the quiet man with a jar of comfrey root. These were the real frontline caregivers of the medieval world. When all else failed, sometimes nothing worked. The child didn't wake. The wound blackened. The fever rose past the point of return. In these moments, the healer's role shifted from cure to comfort. They would sit quietly by the fire, holding a hand. Wash the dying with warm water and herbs. Whisper familiar prayers. Prepare the body for burial with dignity. This, too, was healing not of the body, but of the community. And yet, one cannot help but wonder. What happened when the world changed again, when kings called for professional physicians, when cities outlawed traditional healing, and the tools of the common folk were labeled as relics of ignorance? It is the year 1501. The village of Elmford prepares for spring planting. Children chase each other between low, thatched cottages. A woman hangs herbs to dry in the rafters. The air is thick with peat smoke and the earthy scent of churned soil. It looks like any other day, but something is changing. The local lord has begun to enforce a new decree. Only licensed practitioners may treat illness or perform births. A letter from the nearby town speaks of a physician who will visit once a month to offer approved remedies. And the old healer Agnes, who has tended this village for 40 years, sits quietly by the hearth. No one dares speak it aloud, but some already call her unwise. The world is moving on. The rise of professional medicine. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Europe was undergoing a transformation. The printing press, the Renaissance, and the early stirrings of scientific inquiry were redefining knowledge and power. Medicine was becoming professionalized. University-trained physicians sought control over who could practice. Guilds and colleges like the College of Physicians in London began regulating entry to the field. Medical licenses were introduced in many regions. Anatomical studies, informed by dissection and observation, began to challenge Galenic theory. To those in towns and cities, this was progress, but to the people in the villages, it felt like something else entirely: displacement. The herbalist, the midwife, the bone setter, these roles, once honored out of necessity, were increasingly marginalized. Their remedies were dismissed as superstition. Their practices, though based on generations of trial and error, were labeled dangerous, unscientific, even criminal. And so quietly, they began to vanish. The midwife under scrutiny. Among the most affected were midwives. For centuries, they had guided women through childbirth, treated postpartum complications, and cared for the newborn. But by the 16th century, church and state alike began to scrutinize them more harshly. Midwives were required to swear oaths and register with authorities, forbidden from using certain prayers or charms, accused in some regions of witchcraft if a mother or baby died. Some were prosecuted, others gave up their practice altogether, but many continued in secret, called upon by their neighbors when no one else would come. And still, babies were born by firelight, into the waiting hands of someone who had delivered dozens, perhaps hundreds of children before. From hearth to history, the fatting of folk medicine. As modern medicine advanced, the tools and knowledge of the common folk were not written down. There were no textbooks of peasant pharmacology, no treatises on the healing properties of hedgerow plants passed from mother to daughter. Theirs was a living tradition, preserved only through memory, use, and community. With the growth of towns, the expansion of state power, and the standardization of knowledge, much of this wisdom faded from daily life. But it didn't disappear entirely. In remote regions of Europe, especially in the Scottish Highlands, the Balkans, the Alpine villages, and parts of Ireland, folk healing survived into the 18th and even 19th centuries. Some of its practices have even been revived today, studied by ethnobotanists and medical historians. What they got right. Modern science has, slowly, begun to rediscover the wisdom hidden in these village cures. Elderberries used for colds and fevers have antiviral properties. Meadowsweet used for stomach aches contains salicylates akin to aspirin. St. John's wort, once used for melancholy, is now known to affect mood. Raw honey, long used on wounds, is now a treatment in modern wound care. What the village healer lacked in theory, she often made up for in practice, pattern recognition and care. She was a student of bodies, seasons, plants, and people. Her treatment might not have cured, but it often comforted. And in a world where comfort was rare, that mattered. Healing as community. More than anything, the village healer offered something that professional medicine still struggles to replicate: presence. She sat by the bedside. She waited through long nights. She tended the dying with quiet hands and whispered prayers. She knew each family, each child, each history. Her work was not efficient, it was not scalable, but it was deeply human. And so, even as professional medicine marched on armed with Latin, anatomy, and instruments of steel, something was lost when she faded into history. A legacy in the roots. Today you can walk through a quiet field in the countryside anywhere in Europe and see the plants once gathered by those forgotten healers: yarrow, nettle, mugwort, plantain, sage. They still grow, quietly waiting for someone to remember. Because the story of medicine is not just one of surgeons and scholars. It is also the story of nameless women with clay pots of salves, of quiet men who learned to set bones with rough hands, of entire communities who trusted not in books, but in each other. And perhaps the final question we must ask is this: what might we rediscover if we listen again to the voices that history chose not to write down? Story 4. The Black Death's hidden healers plague doctors and their practices. The year is 1348. The streets of Avignon are silent. Doors are barred, curtains drawn, bells toll in the distance, not to mark the hour but to announce another death. In the marketplace, pigeons peck at fallen bread beside a pair of wooden carts, each piled high with the shrouded dead, and through the foul air a figure approaches. You see him in the distance, cloaked in long black robes, wearing gloves and boots, his face hidden beneath a bird-like mask. He carries a wooden staff, which he uses to prod the sick or point at their door. This is not a demon or ghost, it is a doctor. Or at least, what passed for one in a time of plague. The plague doctor, a figure both iconic and misunderstood, emerged in response to one of the most devastating pandemics in human history. He was a creature of desperation, created not by medical advancement, but by social panic and civic need. And his story begins not in surgical halls, but in the corridors of power, contracts, and fear. The plague arrives. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, carried by ships into the Sicilian port of Messina. Over the next few years, it spread like wildfire by land, river, and sea, reaching every corner of Europe. By 1351, as much as 1/3 of the population was dead. No one knew why. The prevailing theory was miasma, bad air, tainted by corruption or sin. Others blamed Jews, lepers, or celestial alignments. The church offered prayers, but many clergy died as well. In this chaos, physicians were either overwhelmed, unwilling, or simply fled. And so towns and cities began to hire men to serve a specific, grim role, caring for the sick, counting the dead, and when needed marking the homes of those who would not live to see the week's end. Thus the plague doctor was born. Who were the plague doctors? Contrary to modern myth, plague doctors were rarely the best or most educated physicians. In many cases they were physicians of modest reputation, unable to maintain a private practice. Medical students seeking experience or pay. Scribes or clerks with some literacy, hired to record deaths. Foreign doctors contracted from outside a city to avoid conflict of interest. They were not volunteers. In fact, plague doctors were often contracted by local authorities, city councils, magistrates, or church officials. These contracts spelled out pay, responsibilities, and occasionally death benefits for surviving family members. The job was dangerous. Most did not last long. But for some, it was an opportunity, a steady wage in uncertain times, a chance to practice medicine or, at the very least, survive by being slightly more protected than the average citizen. The costume, protection, or symbol. The famous plague doctor costume, black robe, gloves, wide-brimmed hat, and bird-beaked mask was not widely adopted until the 17th century, particularly in France and Italy. However, it is often associated with earlier plague outbreaks due to its symbolic power. The mask, shaped like a bird's beak, was not decorative. It had a practical, if misguided, purpose. Inside the beak were aromatic substances: dried roses, cloves, mint, myrrh, camphor, vinegar-soaked sponges. These were intended to filter out the miasma, the bad air, believed to cause plague. The mask thus acted as a rudimentary gas mask. The rest of the costume, a waxed linen or leather robe, boots, gloves, and hat, was meant to prevent contact with infected air or bodily fluids. The staff allowed doctors to examine patients from a distance, lift garments, or check pulses without touching the skin. It was a kind of early PPE, personal protective equipment, based more on superstition than science, but arguably not entirely ineffective. Still, many early plague doctors didn't wear such outfits. They went barefaced, poorly protected, and deeply vulnerable. What did they actually do? Plague doctors had a grim and limited set of duties: documenting cases of plague and death, examining patients to confirm plague symptoms, marking homes where plague had been identified, advising quarantine or isolation when needed, draining buboes, swollen lymph nodes, by lancing them, a dangerous and rarely effective procedure, administering remedies, often herbal or purgative, escorting the dead to burial sites or plague pits. They had no real power to enforce quarantines, but acted as go-betweens, relaying information to city leaders and providing rudimentary care when no one else would. Some wrote plague treatises, offering theories and recording symptoms. Others simply took their pay and disappeared when the danger became too great. Quarantine and containment. By the late 14th century, cities began to experiment with quarantine. The term itself comes from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days, the time ships were held offshore before passengers were allowed to disembark. Plague doctors often assisted in this process, inspecting arrivals, monitoring symptoms, and determining whether homes should be sealed. In Venice and Milan, specialized plague hospitals called lazarettos were established to isolate the sick. Plague doctors worked within these facilities, often under horrific conditions. In some places, entire houses were boarded up, windows nailed shut, food passed through a hole. The doctor might be the only outside contact, delivering medicine or news. It was a system born of fear, trial, and desperation. Treatments and remedies. Plague doctors offered what they could. Some of the more common treatments included bloodletting to balance the humors, purgative, strong laxatives to cleanse the body, herbal fumigation, burning rosemary, sage, or sulfur in rooms, lancing of buboes, often without sterilization, dietary advice, including avoidance of certain meats or dairy, amulets or talismans sold to ward off disease. None of these worked, but they gave the illusion of action, and for many, that was preferable to doing nothing. Occasionally, some treatments offered comfort. Warm compresses, herbal infusions, or isolation may have slightly improved chances of survival. But most plague doctors were chroniclers, not saviors. Their legacy is not one of cures, but of bearing witness. Unanswered questions. Despite their iconic image, we know surprisingly little about many individual plague doctors. Few left records. Some died anonymously. Others faded from history when the outbreak passed. They were reviled, feared, ignored, and yet essential. Who were these men really? What did they believe as they walked through streets filled with the dying? Did they feel noble, terrified, numb? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, did they know that they could not save anyone, but chose to stay anyway? The year is 1372. The plague has ebbed but not vanished. In Florence, the streets are lively again, but the shadow of death still lingers in doorways and memories. In London, people speak cautiously of the great pestilence, and in the countryside, whole fields lie untended fallow from years of labor lost to the plague. But the city of Ragusa, on the Dalmatian coast, is trying something new. They've built a remote station on an island away from the harbor where all ships must wait 40 days before unloading. A lazaretto. Inside, a doctor walks the length of the shore, watching the ships through a mask that makes him look more bird than man. He has no cure, but he is not powerless. He is part of something new, a system, imperfect and improvised, designed not to heal individuals but to protect communities. The rise of public health in concept, if not in name. Before the 14th century, medicine in Europe was almost entirely personal or spiritual. You got sick, you prayed. You saw a wise woman or a physician if you could afford it. You burned herbs in your home. The village healer came by. Maybe, if you were lucky, you got better. But plague, true epidemic, forced cities to think beyond individuals. With so many dying so quickly, local governments began developing early forms of public health response. Plague doctors, hired by municipalities, became central to this approach. They were no longer simply physicians. They were medical bureaucrats tasked with tracking mortality rates, recording symptoms, reporting clusters of cases, managing burial protocols, advising authorities on restrictions. Even when their treatments were ineffective, their data was not. In Venice, Milan, and later in cities across the Holy Roman Empire, plague doctors created early versions of death registers, compiled symptom records, and helped implement citywide health boards, precursors to modern health departments. Their notes, letters, and treatises helped later generations understand not just the plague, but how to respond. Instruments of control and fear. But the plague doctor also became a figure of dread. To see one on your street meant the plague had arrived. His staff knocked on your door gently or not. He might order your house sealed, your family quarantined. His presence meant your neighbors might soon be dead. And if he wore the full mask, children might flee at the sight of him. There were rumors, some true. Others imagined that plague doctors used the opportunity to steal, to extort, or simply to abandon patients too far gone. Some were accused of spreading the plague instead of treating it. And yet others became local heroes. Some risked their lives daily to treat the dying. They lived in lodging houses close to lazarettos, isolated from families and friends. Few got rich. Many died alone, remembered only in faded records. It was a strange sort of status, indispensable yet feared. The beak as barrier, a practical myth. Let us return to the famous mask. Though the fully developed beaked outfit did not become widespread until the 17th century, its concept emerged in earlier forms. A few things are worth noting. It was not universal. Many plague doctors never wore one. Its effectiveness was minimal, though some herbs inside the beak may have repelled fleas or masked putrid odors. The shape had symbolic power. The beak, combined with black robes, turned the doctor into something between man and omen, a walking embodiment of the boundary between life and death. And yet, for all its theatricality, the mask also marked the beginning of an idea. That contagion might pass through the air, and that protective barriers might offer safety. In that sense, the beak doctor was a primitive ancestor to the hazmat-suited epidemiologist. The quiet innovations hidden in crisis. Despite the fear, confusion, and high death toll, the response to the Black Death brought about subtle shifts in medicine. One quarantine as policy. First formalized in Ragusa, 1377, the 40-day hold became standard across port cities. Land quarantines were also imposed, guards posted at town borders, roadblocks established. 2. Centralized death records. Plague doctors maintained lists of the dead, often categorized by neighborhood. These early records helped identify patterns: age, symptoms, speed of death. 3. Early medical literature on epidemics. Several plague doctors wrote treatises detailing symptoms, treatment attempts, and theories. For example, Jacques d'Agremont of Leyda wrote a Regiment de Preservatio de Pestilentia, 1348, providing advice to avoid plague, including the value of clean air, movement, and isolation. These weren't cures, but they were data, and in time, data would change everything. Not all heroes wore beaks. It's easy to fixate on the mask, but not all plague doctors wore them, and not all healers were men in cloaks. In smaller towns, healing still fell to local clergy, nuns, or even commoners who volunteered to tend to the sick when no one else would. These individuals rarely recorded cleaned wounds, fed the dying, comforted the abandoned. In one town in Germany, a young woman named Anna reportedly tended to over 50 plague victims in her home. In another, a monk lived alone with the sick for months until he too succumbed. They had no titles, no pay, no protection. But they were also plague doctors in the truest sense. A job no one wanted, but someone had to do. To be a plague doctor was to exist in a strange role, part healer, part official, part omen. You were not loved, but you were necessary. Your treatments did little, but your presence gave the illusion of order. You could not stop the plague, but you gave it shape. And in a time when death came faceless and fast, that was no small thing. But as the centuries turned, and the plague returned again and again, did anything change? Did anyone finally learn how to treat this mysterious horror? Or did plague doctors remain masked witnesses to a tragedy they could never cure? It is now 1721. In the bustling port of Marseille, France, a ship arrives from the Levant. Within weeks, people begin to fall ill. The city descends into panic as the Great Plague of Marseille takes hold. It is one of the last major outbreaks of bubonic plague in Western Europe. Once again, the authorities hire plague doctors. And once again, they appear in long black robes, beaked masks filled with herbs, and wide-brimmed hats, almost theatrical now, like actors playing a grim part. But these doctors are no longer folk heroes or mystery figures. They are part of an official system, their role more ceremonial than curative. And as this plague fades, so too does the figure of the plague doctor into history, myth, and memory. Plague wanes, but medicine marches on. The great outbreaks of plague continued into the 18th century in parts of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, but something had shifted. Improved sanitation in growing cities. Greater understanding of contagion, if not germ theory. Stronger government responses and early health boards. Public health measures like quarantines, waste removal, and burial reforms. All contributed to the plague's gradual decline in Europe. By the time of the 19th century cholera pandemics, a new medical model was emerging, one based on science, statistics, and state control. The plague doctor, once born of civic panic and superstition, no longer had a place. His tools, staff, beak, robe were obsolete. His presence was now symbolic, used in art, satire, or memory, not practice. Yet his influence lingered, in ways both obvious and subtle. What the plague doctor left behind. Though largely powerless against the disease he was hired to combat, the plague doctor left behind several quiet legacies. 1. The early framework for epidemic response. Centralized data collection. Death and symptom records. Geographic tracking of outbreaks. All began with the reports and registries kept by plague doctors in cities like Milan, Venice, and Paris. 2. The concept of disease as public concern. Before the plague, illness was personal, a matter of sin, punishment, or bad luck. Afterward, it became something that governments had to manage, leading to early forms of epidemiology, public health planning, and medical licensing. 3. Precursors to protective equipment. While the beaked mask did little to stop disease, it was a step toward barrier protection, a concept that would later evolve into antiseptic surgery, hospital hygiene, and eventually, the PPE worn during modern outbreaks. 4. Civic medicine. The plague doctor was not a private physician. He was hired by the city, a concept that foreshadowed the rise of state-funded healthcare, medical officers, and the idea that health was a public responsibility. The beak in popular imagination. In art, the plague doctor has become an enduring figure. He appears in satirical engravings of the 17th and 18th centuries, often depicted as greedy, foolish, or sinister. In carnival costumes, the mask became a macabre symbol, both frightening and theatrical. In modern media, from novels to video games, he is reborn as a symbol of apocalyptic fear, Gothic medicine, or historical horror. But behind the costume was a real human being, often poorly trained, often terrified, sometimes greedy but sometimes compassionate too. A person who stepped into the midst of one of history's most terrifying diseases and tried, however feebly, to help. Anonymity and sacrifice. Most plague doctors are lost to history. We know few names. No great discoveries bear their signatures. No medical schools were founded in their honor. They were rarely remembered as heroes, more often as symbols of fear or futility. And yet they served. They stepped into infected homes, walked among the dying, took notes, administered what they could, and in doing so they became part of something larger, a societal effort to hold onto structure amid collapse. They bore witness. Even when they could not cure, they counted. They observed, they tried. In that effort, however flawed, we see the beginnings of something profound, the idea that even in a time of hopelessness, someone must be there, to help, to record, to stay. The final reflection. What then do we take from the story of the plague doctor? We take the realization that medicine has not always been about certainty, that many of the systems we now rely on, quarantine, reporting, protective gear, and public health coordination, began not in labs, but in crisis. And we remember that healing is not always about curing. Sometimes it's about presence, about doing your duty when others flee, about acknowledging suffering and refusing to look away. The plague doctor looked like death, but in many ways, he was the first to try and stop it from taking everything. So as we move through our own modern plagues, fears, and uncertainties, it's worth asking, what will our legacy be, and who will wear the masks in our time of need? Story 5. War and Wounds: How Knights Survived the Crusades. The year is 1191. Dust clings to your armor as you stagger from the chaos of battle. The sun beats down like a hammer. The air reeks of blood, sweat, and the oily smoke of burning siege engines. Behind you, the fields outside Acre are littered with bodies, Saracen and Crusader alike. You look down, an arrow has struck your thigh, snapped off, buried deep. Your mail has slowed it but not stopped it. The pain is dull now, masked by exhaustion, but you know it will grow. And so begins your wait for the surgeon. The reality of wounds in the Crusades. The romantic image of the Crusades' knights in shining armor, holy battles, righteous glory obscures a grim and constant truth: Injury was inevitable, and for those who survived the sword, spear, or scimitar, the greater danger often came afterward: infection, fever, and decay. The First Crusade, 1096–1099, followed by several more over the next 2 centuries, exposed Western knights to new enemies, climates, and battle tactics. But it also exposed them to new wounds and new forms of suffering. Armor was heavy and offered protection, but even a glancing blow could cause deep bruising, broken bones, or torn ligaments. Direct hits from arrows, crossbow bolts, or curved Saracen blades could slice through mail and flesh alike. And the battlefield offered no mercy. Wounded knights were dragged to the rear or left behind. Their chances depended not just on their status, but on who was nearby, what tools were available, and how fast the bleeding could be stopped. The battlefield surgeon. There were no trained medics embedded with each unit, but larger crusading armies, especially those organized by royal or noble houses, sometimes traveled with surgeons, barber-surgeons, or monastic medics. These men were not physicians in the modern sense. They were often practical craftsmen, those who had learned to cut flesh, set bones, or treat infection through experience, not study. A typical field surgery might involve inspection of the wound, usually by touch and smell; extraction of embedded weapons using forceps or fingers; washing the wound often with wine, vinegar, or even urine; application of salves, such as honey, fat, or herbal poultices; bandaging, sometimes sewn into place; cauterization, if bleeding could not be stopped. Speed was crucial. Pain relief was minimal alcohol, opium if available, or simply biting down on a strap of leather. In the open air, with flies buzzing and the sun beating down, surgery was more endurance than science. But some knights survived, and their stories became part of the lore of the campaign. Medical crossroads, East meets West. The Crusades were not just military conflicts, they were cultural collisions. And among the most significant exchanges was in the field of medicine. In the Islamic world, medicine was far more advanced at the time. Cities like Damascus, Cairo, and Baghdad had hospitals, bimaristans, medical schools, and trained physicians who studied Greek, Roman, and Arabic texts. Surgeons like al-Zahrawi, al-Bukasis, had compiled detailed surgical manuals, including illustrations of tools and techniques. These texts were often unknown in the Latin West. Some Crusader leaders, particularly in later campaigns, came into contact with Muslim physicians. Treaties were struck to allow care for wounded soldiers. In rare cases, Christian knights were treated by Muslim doctors, and vice versa. From this uneasy exchange came knowledge transfer. Methods of treating wounds with antiseptics like alcohol and vinegar. Surgical techniques such as wound stitching and cleaning. Use of cooling poultices to reduce inflammation. The Crusades helped carry Arabic medical texts back to Europe, where they were slowly translated into Latin. Over time, these works influenced Western medicine, though not without resistance. Common wounds and improvised treatments. Let's consider the kinds of injuries common during Crusader campaigns and what might be done about them. 1. Arrow and crossbow wounds, often removed with tongs or knives. Shafts sometimes pushed through rather than pulled back, to avoid barbed heads tearing flesh. Treated with wine or brine, then packed with cloth and herbs. 2. Limb fractures, set with wooden splints and bound tightly. Immobilized using belts, slings, or spare armor pieces. Healing often incomplete, many knights fought again with crooked limbs. 3. Blade lacerations, cleaned with vinegar or oil. Bound with cloth, stitched if deep. Cauterized if bleeding persisted. 4. Burns from siege weapons, oil, fire, arrows. Covered with honey, lard, or herbal salves. Sometimes left open to breathe, which often invited infection. 5. Infections, recognized by smell, heat, and pus. treated by opening abscesses and draining. Herbs like garlic, onion, and yarrow were sometimes applied. Fever, if it came, was usually fatal. Recovery depended on the wound, the patient's constitution, the climate, and luck. A knight who survived his wounds might carry the scars for life, a missing limb, a crooked nose, a blind eye. And yet, some returned home living reminders of war's cost and the imperfect art of survival. The role of faith in healing. Healing during the Crusades was not purely physical. Wounds were often seen as tests of faith or even marks of divine favor. A knight wounded in battle might be seen as spiritually strengthened. Some wounds were said to emit sweet scents, proof of sainthood. Many knights carried relics into battle, fragments of the true cross, bones of saints, or holy oils. If injured, these relics might be placed on the wound or used to anoint the body. Monks, priests, and bishops accompanied the armies, offering last rites, prayers, and confession to the wounded. In some cases, entire orders like the Knights Hospitaller were founded with the dual mission of fighting and healing. The line between medicine and miracle was thin. Surviving the journey, not just the battle. Many crusaders never saw battle, but died en route from dehydration in desert crossings, dysentery from spoiled food or water, heat stroke, infected blisters, or insect bites. Those who survived to fight and then to heal were considered fortunate, and they often credited divine will, brotherhood, and sheer endurance. Still, a question lingers in the dust of the Holy Land. In the face of injury, ignorance, and unimaginable pain, how did they keep going? And what did the survivors carry home beyond their scars? It is the evening after battle. The wounded moan softly across the field, scattered like broken dolls. Tents are hastily erected from torn sails and cloaks. Fires burn low. Water is short. The flies are already thick. You lie under rough canvas, your leg wrapped in stained linen. Someone tried to clean the wound, but the pain is growing hot, pulsing. You know the signs. This is where the real battle begins. Aftermath of the battle, triage in the dirt. Crusader armies were rarely prepared for the medical consequences of their victories or defeats. After major clashes like the Siege of Antioch, 1098, or the Battle of Hattin, 1187, the wounded far outnumbered those who could help. There was no organized field hospital. Instead, tents or shelters were assembled where possible, behind hills, in churches, or among the ruins of captured towns. Here, the wounded were sorted. Those lightly injured were given food, water, and rest. Those gravely wounded were tended to if there was time and hope. Those beyond help were given last rites or left to die. The process was harsh but necessary. There were no illusions about the limits of medicine. Still, healing happened even in the filth and confusion. Improvised hospitals and the birth of the Hospitallers. Some groups attempted to bring order to the chaos. The most famous was the Knights Hospitaller, formed in the 11th century in Jerusalem. Originally known as the Order of the Hospital of St. John, they began as a monastic group tasked with caring for poor and sick pilgrims. As the Crusades intensified, they evolved into a military medical order, building hospitals in key cities like Jerusalem, Acre, and Rhodes. These hospitals were surprisingly advanced. Rows of clean beds, running water in some cases, use of linen bandages, separate wards for different ailments, regular distribution of bread, wine, and meat. The Hospitallers trained their brothers in basic care, cleaning wounds, changing dressings, administering herbal remedies. Their hospitals became safe havens for the wounded regardless of faith or nationality. There are records of Muslim patients being treated within their walls, a rare display of mercy in a brutal war. The tools of healing. Back in the field, less organized care continued. Surgeons, those who followed the army, or were recruited from among the ranks carried basic kits. Knives and scalpels, forceps, needles and sinew for stitching, hot irons for cauterization, wooden splints. Linen bandages were boiled when possible. Wounds were cleaned with wine, vinegar, or brine, the only available antiseptics. Salves made from olive oil, lard, beeswax, and herbs were common. Notably, maggots were sometimes left in wounds if they appeared. Though accidental, this had surprising medical benefits. The maggots fed on dead tissue, keeping the wound clean. Modern medicine would later rediscover maggot therapy, but the Crusaders witnessed it firsthand, without understanding why it helped. When the flesh turned black, infection was a constant threat. Wounds that festered, especially those near joints or the abdomen, often led to gangrene. Signs included blackening skin, foul odor, rapid fever, delirium. Once infection set in, the only treatment was amputation. This was done sparingly, few survived, and the tools were crude. The process involved applying a tourniquet, often a belt or rope, cutting through muscle and flesh, sawing through bone, cauterizing the stump to stop bleeding. Pain relief was minimal. Some used opium or strong wine, but often the only option was biting down and enduring. Many patients died during or after surgery from shock, blood loss, or infection. Yet some lived. Knights who survived amputations became symbols of resilience. Some returned to battle with wooden prosthetics. Others became monastic warriors or advisors. Their scars became proof of their faith and sacrifice. A long recovery in hostile lands. If a knight survived the initial injury and infection, his recovery still depended on clean water, steady food, shelter from heat or cold, regular bandage changes. These were rare luxuries in desert campaigns. Pilgrims and crusaders often carried herbs with them: lavender, sage, poppy seeds, cumin used in teas or poultices. Some believed crushed pearls or ground silver could purify wounds. Others applied holy relics, prayers, or even inscriptions carved into lead tablets worn around the neck. One popular charm read, "Christ conquers, Christ reigns, Christ heals." But the body, more than the prayer, did the work. Knights lay still for weeks, sometimes months, watched over by servants or fellow crusaders. Wounds were reopened if swelling returned. Flesh was cut away inch by inch. Sleep came and went. Fever rose and fell. Those who survived were often weakened but hardened. Memory in the scar tissue. Wounds carried stories. A scar on the face might speak of hand-to-hand combat. A crooked leg might recall a siege engine's fall. A missing hand, a moment of heroism or failure. These wounds became part of a knight's identity. Many chose to display them, refusing prosthetics or coverings. In some orders, scars were seen as marks of divine favor, evidence that God had tested them and they had endured. Back in Europe, these survivors were often honored, especially if they bore visible injuries. Their tales filled chronicles and chansons. Their wounds became part of Christian martyrdom mythology, linking body and faith. But not all stories were celebrated. Some returned broken, disfigured, forgotten, or mad. The trauma of injury, compounded by heat, isolation, and spiritual crisis, left many mentally scarred. And here we find the unanswered question that shadows this part of history. How many men survived the battlefield, but never truly returned home? It is the spring of 1204. You ride slowly through the gates of your homeland. The banners are familiar, but your armor no longer shines. A scarf hides the jagged scar that bisects your cheek. Your hand, now wooden and strapped to your forearm, moves only when your whole body shifts. The road home is lined with fields you once walked as a boy, but you are no longer that boy. You are a survivor, a knight who returned not just from battle, but from wounds that should have killed you. And though you are alive, you are not unchanged. Returning home, the wounded veteran. For knights who returned from the Holy Land, physical wounds were only part of their burden. Some came back blind, maimed, or disfigured. Others carried phantom pain or limbs that never fully healed. Many suffered from what we might now call post-traumatic stress, then considered madness or melancholy. And all carried stories of what they had seen and what they had lost. Yet despite their suffering, these men were often celebrated. Wounds were interpreted as sacred marks, proof of divine favor, suffering in service of Christendom. In royal courts and monastic chronicles, tales of their bravery were embellished. Scarred faces and limping gaits became badges of honor, at least for those fortunate enough to belong to noble houses. But for common soldiers, servants, or lower-ranking knights, the return was less glorious. Many faded into obscurity, living quietly with injuries, relying on charity or family. The social support system was limited. Pensions, if they existed, were rare and small. The healing journey didn't end with the body, it often never ended at all. Medical lessons brought back. Though the medical care during the Crusades was primitive, the experiences brought back with the survivors helped push European medicine slowly forward. 1. Surgical practice. Surgeons gained first-hand experience with wounds not seen in peacetime: deep lacerations, crush injuries, burns, and amputations. Techniques like cauterization, bone setting, and wound stitching were refined under pressure. 2. Wound observation. Soldiers began to understand which wound types healed better. It was observed that clean wounds had better outcomes, a step toward future antiseptic practices. 3. Exposure to Arabic medicine. The works of al-Zahrawi, Avicenna, and al-Razi were brought back and translated. Arabic surgical tools and techniques influenced European texts for generations. Concepts of systematic diagnosis, hospital organization, and patient care trickled into Western thought. Even if not adopted immediately, these seeds had been planted. From individual care to institutional medicine, the trauma of mass injury created a new awareness. Individual healers were not enough. As a result, military hospitals became more organized. Orders like the Knights Hospitaller expanded their medical missions. Royal courts and armies began to recognize the need for permanent medical staff during campaigns. By the 13th and 14th centuries, some armies traveled with dedicated medical wagons, surgical tents, and supplies rudimentary, but revolutionary compared to earlier campaigns. And in the civilian world, hospitals began to grow not just for the poor or the monastic ill, but for soldiers and veterans. The Crusades had created a new medical identity, the wounded warrior, and with it, a slowly expanding infrastructure of care. Faith, medicine, and the afterlife. For many wounded crusaders, spiritual healing remained paramount. Pilgrimages continued even after returning from war. Wounds were confessed as sins or offered as penance. Some entered monasteries, devoting their lives to prayer and care. Others became hermits, seeking peace in isolation. There were also relics, pieces of saints, bones or fragments from the Holy Land that were believed to heal lingering injuries or protect against pain. Some crusaders kept them close for life, tied to their belts or hidden beneath tunics. Faith remained intertwined, with every stage of healing from battlefield to grave. The legacy of the wounded. The Crusades did not bring medical revolution. They brought hardship, pain, and the suffering of thousands. But from that suffering came fragments of knowledge, a better understanding of trauma, a growing awareness of infection and cleanliness, an appreciation for practical over theoretical healing. The idea that organized care, not just individual effort, was essential. And just as importantly, The Crusades left behind a cultural memory of survival. Paintings and tapestries showed knights with bandaged limbs. Chronicles described miraculous recoveries and saintly intervention. Surgeons began to document their methods, leading to new medical texts. The scars of the Crusades were written not just on bodies, but in books, beliefs, and budding institutions. And even today, when we speak of battlefield medicine, triage, and trauma surgery, we echo practices first developed in those brutal, dust-choked campaigns of the medieval East. The final reflection. The story of medicine in the Crusades is not one of triumph. It is a story of persistence in pain, of men carrying their wounds across deserts and oceans, of healing that came too late or not at all. But in their suffering and in the efforts of those who tried to treat them, we see the early roots of modern trauma care. Crude, yes, often cruel, but not without meaning. And so we ask, as the last tent is folded and the last wounded knight limps home, what after all is the value of a life saved not just by skill, but by the will to try? Story 6. Wound Care in the 100 Years' War. Mud, Maggots, and Miracles. It is October 25th, 1415. The field is wet, churned into a thick paste by the tramping of thousands of feet and the rain of the night before. Crows wheel overhead. The bodies of French knights lie crumpled in the mud, their gleaming armor now mottled with filth and gore. You, an English longbowman, kneel behind a makeshift barricade, your leg trembling beneath you, blood leaking slowly from a deep slash at your thigh. The Battle of Agincourt has ended. The war has not. And now the real danger begins. The 100 Years' War, a century of injury. The 100 Years' War 1337–1453 was not a single, continuous campaign, but a series of protracted conflicts between the kingdoms of England and France. It saw sieges, pitched battles, skirmishes, and famines. It spanned generations, and it wounded more men than it killed. Unlike the Crusades, this was a war fought on home soil, by kings, nobles, mercenaries, and peasants alike. The battlefield was not some distant land, it was the fields outside your village, the bridge near your abbey, the castle whose towers you once admired as a boy. And when the fighting stopped for a day, a week, or a season, the wounded remained. From sword to sickness, the nature of injury. The weapons of the 100 Years' War were brutally efficient. Longbows fired arrows that could pierce armor at long range, shattering bone or embedding deep in muscle. Polearms, like halberds and glaives, could break limbs with a single blow. Swords, increasingly designed for thrusting, punctured armor gaps and left deep internal wounds. Blunt trauma from maces, hammers, or being trampled caused internal bleeding, concussions, and shattered joints. Armor offered protection, but it wasn't foolproof, and even minor wounds, if unclean, could fester and kill. In this age, infection was the true enemy, and it often came not from the blade, but from the mud. Wounded men collapsed into fields soaked with blood, urine, animal droppings, and human filth. These wounds were never sterile, and treatment, if it came at all, was often delayed. The healers at war, barber-surgeons in the field. During the 100 Years' War, barber-surgeons had become more common within military camps. Unlike physicians, who often stayed far from the battlefield, surgeons were present, moving among the tents after battle to pull arrows, bind wounds, drain abscesses, saw off damaged limbs, apply cauterizing irons to stop bleeding. Their tools were simple. Iron forceps, often heated before use. Scalpels and knives, reused and rarely cleaned. Needles threaded with silk, linen, or catgut. Hot coals or iron rods for cauterization. Bandages soaked in wine, vinegar, or herbal tinctures. In the better supplied armies, surgeons sometimes worked in teams, with assistants who held down patients or fetched water. But even then, conditions were primitive. Pain relief was limited to alcohol, opium, when available, or prayer. Recovery was rare. Infection was expected. The mud and the maggots. There is a peculiar note in some chroniclers' records. Certain wounds, infested with maggots, healed better. Soldiers left untreated in the field for days sometimes developed maggot-infested wounds. These larvae, feeding only on dead tissue, cleaned the wound of rot and reduced the risk of spreading infection. Barber-surgeons took notice. Some even began to allow maggots to remain, realizing though they could not explain that they did more good than harm. Today, we call this biotherapy, but in the 14th century, it was a grim blessing from the battlefield. Other battlefield miracles included boiled wine used as antiseptic, described by Guy de Chauliac, a prominent French surgeon. Moss from certain trees used to pack wounds. Honey applied for burns and infected cuts, with some antibacterial effect. Turpentine, sometimes applied to wounds or amputated. Stumps a practice both painful and occasionally helpful in reducing bacterial growth. These were empirical discoveries, learned not from books, but from the stubborn persistence of men forced to treat what others would not touch, when the surgeon could not help. But often the damage was too great. Punctured intestines led to fatal infection within hours or days. Severed limbs bled out unless quickly tied off. Facial injuries were disfiguring, dangerous, and largely untreatable. Concussions and internal bleeding, often caused by blunt weapons, were invisible and deadly. In these cases, the surgeon could only offer comfort or make the end less painful. And yet survival was not rare. Some men healed scarred, disabled, but alive, and in surviving they became living texts, walking examples of what worked, what didn't, and what might be worth trying next time. Camp life and recovery. A wounded soldier, if he made it back to camp, still had weeks, perhaps months of recovery ahead. He needed food rich in protein and fat, often unavailable. Clean water, even less common. Bandage changes, sometimes daily. Protection from flies and dirt. Camp followers' wives, washerwomen, servants often took over care. They cleaned wounds, boiled rags, fed the injured. Their names were rarely recorded, but their hands saved more lives than surgeons. In some cases, monasteries near battlefields took in the wounded, offering structured care, herbal treatments, and relative cleanliness. These patients had a higher chance of surviving. But for most, healing meant lying on the ground in a crowded tent, waiting to see whether the fever would break or carry them off. And so we must ask, in a war that promised glory but so often delivered agony, what did it mean to survive but never quite recover? It is 1431, the year Joan of Arc is burned at the stake. But elsewhere in France, another soldier lies in a makeshift infirmary, his leg shattered by a cannonball, the skin already turning black. His comrades hold him down. A cloth soaked in wine is shoved between his teeth. The surgeon picks up a curved knife and a saw. He doesn't ask if the patient wants to proceed. He already knows, either the leg comes off or the man dies. This is amputation in the 15th century, brutal, direct, often final. And it was one of the few reliable ways to stop infection from spreading. The surgeon's dilemma. The decision to amputate was not taken lightly. Most medieval surgeons knew the risks. Massive blood loss. Shock which could kill within minutes. The near certainty of infection. The patient's own panic and pain. Yet in certain cases, especially with compound fractures, gangrene, or war wounds contaminated with earth and feces, it was the only chance. Amputation in the field required speed and determination. There were no sterile operating rooms, no anesthesia, and no antiseptics beyond alcohol or wine. A surgeon's tools included a tourniquet, often a leather strap or twisted rope, a broad-bladed knife for cutting through skin and muscle, a bone saw coarse and heavy, red-hot irons or cautery knives to seal the stump and stop bleeding. Patients were rarely tied down. Instead, other men held them in place, sometimes out of duty, sometimes out of horror. The screams could be heard for miles. But if the wound closed, if infection was kept at bay, and if the patients were held, they might live. The recovery, long, lonely, and without guarantee. Post-amputation care was precarious. If a patient survived the operation, he faced weeks of fever, swelling and pus, phantom pain, bleeding from reopened vessels. Surgeons applied dressings of honey, lard, and linen strips, sometimes soaked in wine or vinegar. The stump might be inspected daily or ignored entirely if the camp was on the move. Survivors often fashioned wooden prosthetics, strapping crude limbs to themselves with belts or rope. Others used crutches, canes, or were carried by friends. In a world without rehabilitation or structured aftercare, recovery was deeply personal and almost entirely unsupported. Yet there are records of amputees returning to battle. Some served as messengers, others joined the baggage train or became camp guards. A few even led men, their scars a mark of hard-won wisdom. The influence of Guy de Chauliac. During this period, one of the most influential medical voices was Guy de Chauliac, a French surgeon who served several popes and wrote the seminal text Chirurgia Magna, Great Surgery, completed around 1363. Though he did not serve in the 100 Years' War directly, his work spread through France and England, influencing generations of battlefield surgeons. De Chauliac advocated for cleanliness in wound care as far as the concept existed, use of wine or vinegar to cleanse wounds, drainage of abscesses to prevent infection, stepwise amputation, when necessary cutting above the diseased area, careful bandaging to prevent further trauma. He was skeptical of cauterization, unless absolutely necessary, and emphasized observation over dogma. De Chauliac also translated and preserved Arabic surgical knowledge, including that of al-Zahrawi, Albucases, and Avicenna, helping reintroduce these techniques to Western Europe. His influence would shape not only battlefield medicine, but later academic surgery. Pain, faith, and endurance. Pain management remained rudimentary. Options included wine or strong ale, administered before or during treatment, poppy tinctures or opium, though rare and often reserved for the wealthy, prayer and chants, recited by monks or priests present, physical restraint, the most reliable method of controlling movement. In some regions, especially after 1400, battlefield shrines were erected, small crosses or altars where soldiers and survivors left offerings or said prayers for the wounded. The wounded themselves often turned to pilgrimage as a form of healing. A knight with a crushed arm might make a journey to Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, or Mont Saint Michel, hoping that divine intercession might succeed where the surgeon had failed. The act of pilgrimage was both penance and therapy, a slow, grueling walk that allowed time for healing of both body and soul. The silent workforce, women in battlefield medicine. Though overshadowed by military histories, women played a vital role in healing during the 100 Years' War. Camp followers, often the wives or companions of soldiers, cleaned wounds, boiled water, changed dressings. Nuns and lay sisters in monasteries near battlefields tended to the injured, especially after sieges. Some towns employed female surgeons, especially in France, to assist with non-combatant casualties. Their contributions were rarely recorded, but in practice, they were the backbone of convalescent care. Without them, survival rates would have been even lower. Between two deaths, the wounded who lingered. One of the unique features of this war so long, So fractured was the presence of chronic survivors, men who were wounded in one battle but lived for years afterward, bearing the cost of their service. Some were celebrated, others were discarded. Many became beggars, moving from village to village, living off alms and memories. Towns began to develop charitable hospitals and hostels for these men, early versions of veterans' homes. These institutions were basic, often overcrowded, but they marked a recognition of a new social class, the permanently wounded soldier. And yet one might ask, what happens to a man whose war has ended, but whose wound never truly heals? It is 1453. The war is ending. The English are retreating. The French reclaim Bordeaux. The 100 Years' War, after more than a century of bloodshed, is drawing to a close, but its wounded remain, many thousands of them. Some have been maimed for decades. Others were injured just months ago. Few are whole. Fewer still are remembered. And yet, in the shadow of a war that reshaped nations, a quiet legacy begins to take form. The emergence of organized care for the wounded and the early roots of something resembling military medicine. The war's toll in flesh and memory. We often focus on the battles Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, but between those great clashes were hundreds of lesser fights, raids, ambushes, and sieges. And in every one there were wounds. Arrowheads lodged in joints, arms lost to poleaxes, crushed ribs from falling horses, rotting flesh from untreated gashes. These injuries, more than the victories, define the lived experience of most soldiers. The wound, not the glory, became the enduring reality of war. And those wounds forced the medieval world to reckon with questions it had long avoided. How do we care for those who serve? What do we owe the broken? The rise of war hospitals. During the 100 Years' War, temporary hospitals evolved from ad hoc tents into more structured field stations, often built behind castle walls or in commandeered monasteries. Toward the war's end, towns near major battle routes began to designate permanent buildings for wounded soldiers, assign secular caretakers, not just clergy, stockpile bandages, wine, and simple instruments, establish rudimentary triage systems, treating the most viable cases first. This marked a subtle but significant shift from spiritual healing to practical care. Though still limited in scope, these war hospitals were precursors to the military hospitals that would emerge more fully in the 16th and 17th centuries. They also reflected a growing idea that wounded soldiers were not merely burdens, but investments of the state. The written word and the medical manual. Another key development during this era was the documentation of surgical knowledge, particularly for trauma and battlefield injuries. Thanks in large part to the work of Guy de Chauliac, whose Chirurgia Magna would become a surgical standard for 2 centuries. Henry de Monville, a French surgeon who advocated for clean wound care, the avoidance of pus, and gentle handling of injuries. John of Ardern, an English surgeon who developed treatments for anal fistulae common in mounted soldiers, and described detailed case studies. These texts were copied, translated, and adapted throughout Europe. They included illustrations of surgical tools, wound types, bandaging methods, instructions for amputations, cautery, and even early pain relief techniques. In the aftermath of war, these books became guides not only for surgeons, but for a growing class of literate barber-surgeons and apprentices. It was the beginning of something we now take for granted, the standardization of medical care. Scars as status, the cultural legacy of wounding. For some, wounds brought more than pain, they brought social capital. Veterans with visible injuries often gained. Pensions rare but increasing. Public recognition in festivals or church processions. Exemptions from certain taxes or labor obligations. The right to beg legally, granted through a special license. In France, the Hospice des Quinze-Vingts, originally founded for blind men by King Louis IX, expanded its services during the war to include injured soldiers, marking one of the first semi-public facilities for war-related disability. These acts, piecemeal, imperfect, were early steps toward the concept of veteran care. They also reinforced a broader idea that the cost of war was not just paid in coin, but in human bodies, and that those bodies could not be discarded when the fighting stopped. What they got right and what they missed. Though limited by their understanding of germs, antisepsis, and pain, the caregivers of the 100 Years' War made several discoveries, some accidental, some intentional, that still resonate. Heavy, effective practices. Use of boiled wine and vinegar for cleansing wounds. Honey and moss dressings for reducing infection. Observing that maggot-infested wounds sometimes healed better. Gradually shifting away from encouraging laudable pus. Pus was previously seen as a sign of healthy healing. Enduring errors. Routine use of cautery, which often damaged healthy tissue. Lack of surgical cleanliness. Limited pain management. Widespread belief in humoral imbalances as the root of all disease. Still, the war acted as a brutal teacher. What it taught was retained not in theory alone, but in hands, tools, and practice. And through that practice, medieval surgery began to emerge from the shadows of mysticism and into the slow dawn of science. The aftermath, what became of the wounded. The war's end did not mean the end of suffering. Thousands of former soldiers returned to villages that no longer recognized them, farms they could no longer work, families who had presumed them dead. Many became vagabonds, part of a growing class of displaced veterans. Some took work as guards, mercenaries, or executioners, professions that required strength, but not grace. A few joined monastic orders, choosing silence and solitude. Others wandered. And yet, even in obscurity, they shaped the world. Their survival required new tools, new thinking, and new kinds of care, and slowly, painfully, those needs began to be addressed. The final reflection. When we look back at the 100 Years' War, we often see the politics, the crowns, the treaties, the changing borders. But beneath all of that was the body bleeding, broken, enduring. The surgeons who served these men worked without proper tools, without knowledge of infection, without glory. They held arms steady as bones were reset. They burned away rot with iron. They wrote, observed, and remembered. They did not cure the war, but they helped those who survived it live on. And so we end this story not with a victory march, but with a quiet question. Is there any greater legacy than the knowledge born of pain and used, however imperfectly, to ease the pain of others? Story 7. The apothecary's shelf powders, potions, and peril. You push open a heavy wooden door. A bell rings softly above you. The smell hits first: sharp vinegar, dried herbs, sulfur, and something sweet, almost rotten. It's dark inside, lit only by narrow windows and flickering tallow candles. Shelves line every wall, filled with glass bottles, clay jars, wooden boxes, and bundles of dried plants hanging from the beams. This is not a physician's office. It's not a monastery. This is the apothecary's shop, and in the medieval world, it is where healing often began. What was an apothecary? In medieval Europe, apothecaries were the forerunners of modern pharmacists, but they were much more than that. They were herbalists with deep knowledge of local and imported plants, chemists working with metals, minerals, and early distillation, traders sourcing rare ingredients from across continents, advisors providing remedies to the poor and the elite alike. Occasionally, physicians in all but name, especially in rural areas. Apothecaries served towns, villages, and even royal courts. While physicians and surgeons often operated in academic or noble spheres, the apothecary's shop was more accessible, a place where common people sought relief from everyday ailments. Their remedies weren't always effective. Some were dangerous, but their shelves were a map of medieval thought, equal parts science, superstition, and survival. The structure of the shop. A typical apothecary's shop was a mix of order and chaos. Shelves and cabinets were labeled with Latin names, like Pulvis radicis glycyrrhizae, powdered licorice root, or Syrupus papaverus, poppy syrup. Drawers held dried plants, resins, and roots often ground into powders with heavy mortars. Vials contained tinctures, oils, or suspensions in wine or vinegar. Weights and balances sat on the counter, used to measure dosages carefully. The back room often hid a small laboratory, alembics for distillation, furnaces for calcining minerals, and cauldrons for boiling syrups or decoctions. The smell could be overwhelming. It was a blend of camphor and turpentine, burnt sugar, lavender and rosemary, sulfur, frankincense, and occasionally animal musk. It was equal parts enticing and repulsive. It smelled, quite literally, of medieval medicine. Common remedies on the shelf. Apothecaries sold hundreds of substances, but a few were staples. Herbal tinctures and decoctions. Willow bark, for pain and fever, a precursor to aspirin. Poppy syrup, for sleep and pain relief. Yarrow, to stop bleeding. Horehound, for coughs. Valerian root, for anxiety and sleeplessness. Spiral shell minerals and metals. Antimony, used in purgatives. Mercury, for treating skin conditions, and later syphilis. Arsenic, used externally for ulcers, with caution. Lead-based pastes, for skin and eye disorders. Animal ingredients. Bear fat, used in ointments. Crushed pearls, believed to treat fever and calm the heart. Mummy powder, literally ground human remains, believed to cure internal bleeding and epilepsy. Deer horn shavings, considered a strengthener and aphrodisiac. Globe showing Europe-Africa exotics. Cinnamon, clove, and cardamom, imported from the East, used for digestion. Myrrh and frankincense, both medicinal and religious. Ambergris, a waxy substance from Wales, used in tonics and perfumes. The belief behind many remedies rested in the humoral system, balancing the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Remedies were crafted to cool, warm, dry, or moisten the body. A patient with a fever, hot and dry, might receive cooling herbs like chicory or violet syrup. A phlegmatic cough, cold and wet, might be treated with warming spices and thick syrups. Patients, prescriptions, and practices. Though apothecaries often worked independently, they also served physicians and even monks. A typical interaction might look like this. A physician writes a recipe in Latin for a custom remedy. The apothecary reads and prepares the medicine, often a complex mixture of herbs, minerals, and wine or honey. The patient takes the remedy home with instructions, usually verbal. But in rural areas, many people skip the physician entirely, going straight to the apothecary with their symptoms. This created tension. Physicians accused apothecaries of overstepping, especially if they prescribed or diagnosed. In response, some cities like London or Florence introduced licensing laws and apothecary guilds, trying to formalize the profession. Trust and superstition. Not all remedies were purely medicinal. The line between healing and magic was thin. Many apothecaries also sold amulets to ward off illness, charms written on parchment, holy water, relic dust, or blessed oil, potions for love, fertility, or protection from the evil eye. Some apothecaries embraced these practices. Others offered them quietly, recognizing their value not in efficacy, but in comfort. In times of plague or famine, people often turned to apothecaries not for a cure, but for something to believe in. And that, too, was a kind of healing. The risks of the shelf. Not everything sold was safe. In fact, some substances were deeply toxic. Mercury and lead could cause neurological damage. Opium, if overused, led to addiction and respiratory depression. Arsenic, though applied externally, could be absorbed and kill. Some herbal mixtures caused vomiting, hallucinations, or seizures. Dosage was an art, not a science. Apothecaries measured in grains, scruples, and drams, using uneven tools. One spoonful too many could end a life. Yet for many people, these shops represented their best hope for survival. And so they returned, again and again, clutching their coins, their aches, their children. And perhaps you now wonder, in a world where healing was uncertain, what did people truly seek, a cure, or simply the comfort of being seen? The mortar rings out softly as it grinds dried root against polished stone. You watch the apothecary's hands move swiftly, careful, practiced. He scoops out a pale powder, weighs it on a brass scale, and drops it into a bubbling pot of syrup, stirred with a stick of cinnamon. He leans close. His voice is barely above a whisper. 3 spoonfuls after the evening meal, no more. You nod, but the way he looks at you as though he knows something you don't leaves you unsure. You clutch the warm vial and step back into the street, hoping, as always, that this time it will work. This is the unspoken truth of the apothecary's art. Every cure flirts with the risk of harm. When alchemy meets medicine. In the later Middle Ages, particularly by the 14th and 15th centuries, apothecaries were increasingly influenced by alchemy, the proto-scientific blend of chemistry, philosophy, and mysticism that sought to purify matter and the soul alike. Apothecaries did not merely mix herbs, they calcined metals, burned to ash and mixed into salves, distilled liquids in alembics to extract essences, sublimated powders, reducing solids into vapors, created elixirs of life, spiritus, and waters of strength. Their goal wasn't just healing, it was transformation. Of the body, perhaps, but also of the base into the noble, the sick into the whole. Some even believed diseases were caused by imbalances of elements, not just humors. Remedies had to counteract poisons, both visible and unseen. This alchemical influence blurred the line between pharmacy and philosophy, and apothecaries began referring to some remedies as arcana secrets of the craft. The apothecary and the physician, uneasy allies. Throughout Europe, tension simmered between physicians and apothecaries. Their roles were supposedly distinct. Physicians, university-educated, wealthy, mostly theoretical. They examined patients, diagnosed conditions, and wrote prescriptions, often in Latin. Apothecaries, tradesmen and artisans. They prepared and dispensed the medicine, but were not to diagnose or recommend treatments independently. In theory. In practice, apothecaries often did it all, especially in rural areas or during times of plague, when physicians fled towns to avoid infection. This caused conflict. Physicians accused apothecaries of overstepping their station. Apothecaries accused physicians of prescribing impossible or harmful remedies. Patients simply wanted relief and trusted the person who delivered it. In cities like London, Paris, and Florence, this led to the rise of apothecary guilds, which regulated pricing, standardized ingredients, fined members who mismeasured or misdiagnosed, published pharmacopoeias, books of standardized recipes. Still, enforcement was patchy. Much of the practice remained informal, based on reputation more than law. A poison or a cure, the knife edge of dosage. The line between medicine and poison was razor thin. Apothecaries were acutely aware that many of their most effective ingredients were also toxic in the wrong dose. Consider: opium could relieve pain but suppress breathing. Mercury could kill parasites but also the patient. Arsenic might dry out a sore but destroy flesh beneath it. Foxglove digitalis stimulated the heart but in excess stopped it. There are medieval records of accidental poisonings: children who drank the wrong syrup, servants who misread a label, or elders who took too much of a sleeping draught. And then there were the darker cases. The apothecary and the art of poison. Most apothecaries were honest healers, but some, whether willingly or under pressure, became merchants of death. Across medieval courts, noble houses, and even monastic disputes, poison was a quiet weapon. Tasteless, odorless, and often slow-acting, it left few visible traces. Apothecaries might be asked discreetly to prepare a digestive powder that slowed the heart over days, a tincture of belladonna, causing disorientation and death, a gift of sweetened almonds, laced with cyanogenic compounds. In some cities, laws were passed explicitly forbidding apothecaries from dispensing certain toxins without physician oversight. In Venice and Avignon, apothecaries could be imprisoned or executed if linked to suspicious deaths. Still, the knowledge was there. And knowledge, even in hiding, never fully disappears. Learning and legacy, the rise of formal recipes. Despite the risks, the later Middle Ages also saw increasing efforts to codify and preserve safe practices. The first European pharmacopoeias, books of medicines, began appearing in the 15th century. They offered recipes for common illnesses, dosage guidelines, often by body weight or age, lists of prohibited substitutions, e.g., don't use wild hemlock instead of parsley, storage instructions to prevent spoilage. Guilds enforced these standards, often with public inspections. Apothecaries could be fined or barred from practice for adulterated or mislabeled products. This movement toward standardization was crucial. It laid the groundwork for modern pharmaceutical science, even if it was wrapped in superstition and error. What the people believed. But even with all this structure, the heart of the apothecary's success lay in trust. People believed in the smell of rosemary for memory, the taste of bitter wormwood for stomach worms, the warmth of mustard plasters for chest infections, the color of a powder said to match the organ it healed: red for blood, green for bile. These beliefs, often passed from parent to child, were not easily tested, but neither were they easily dismissed. And in the apothecary's shop, hope was always part of the recipe. So we must ask, when knowledge, danger, and desperation meet behind a wooden counter, how do we decide what's medicine and what's just the illusion of care? You return to the apothecary's shop not for a potion this time, but out of curiosity. The jars are still there. The smell still clings to the air: dried lavender, rotting valerian root, the faint scent of vinegar steeped in herbs. But something feels different now. You've seen what lies behind the jars: the learning, the danger, the humanity. And you realize this place was never just about remedies. It was about survival in a world of uncertainty. The apothecary as scientist. By the end of the medieval period, the apothecary was slowly shifting from folk artisan to proto-scientist. This wasn't a sharp transformation, but a gradual one fueled by a few key developments. Improved record-keeping. Recipes were copied, organized, and preserved in books. Formulas once passed down by memory were written down, edited, and refined. Cross-cultural exchange. European apothecaries began to absorb medical knowledge from the Islamic world, especially through texts by Avicenna, al-Razi, and al-Zahrawi. Guild collaboration. Apothecaries worked more closely with physicians and surgeons, especially in urban centers, where regulation pushed them into more formal roles. Early empirical observation. Some apothecaries began to question tradition, testing remedies themselves or recording patient outcomes. The mortar and pestle didn't just grind herbs. Over time, they ground away at superstition and secrecy, slowly shaping a new kind of medicine. Women behind the shelves. Though guild records and texts often highlight men, women played a significant role in apothecary work. Wives and daughters of apothecaries often worked in the shop, learning the craft informally. In some towns, widows of apothecaries were allowed to continue the business provided they passed inspections or received guild approval. Midwives and herb women often operated as informal apothecaries, especially in rural areas, preparing remedies for childbirth, menstruation, and general health. Some of these women were persecuted, accused of witchcraft or unlicensed practice. Others were quietly accepted, their knowledge too valuable to ignore. Though rarely credited in official records, their contributions helped sustain medieval healthcare, especially for the poor and marginalized. Remedies that endured. Not all medieval remedies were nonsense. In fact, some ingredients used by apothecaries have proven, centuries later, to be surprisingly effective. Here are a few examples. Willow bark contains salicin, a precursor to aspirin. Honey has natural antimicrobial properties and promotes wound healing. Garlic exhibits antibacterial and antifungal effects. Licorice root, used for coughs and digestion, still used today. Foxglove digitalis, now the basis of heart medications. These examples are reminders that medieval apothecaries, for all their limitations, paid attention. They observed what worked, even if they couldn't explain why. Their legacy isn't in the failures, they are in the small, persistent truths that endured across centuries. From shop to pharmacy. As the Renaissance dawned and science began to challenge old dogmas, the role of the apothecary continued to evolve. By the 16th and 17th centuries, apothecaries began operating more like modern pharmacies, focusing on preparation and dispensing, not diagnosis. New institutions, such as university pharmacology departments, began emerging. The first printed pharmacopoeias standardized national remedies. Botanical gardens were created to train apothecary and physicians in plant medicine. In England, the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries was founded in 1617, breaking away from the grocer's company and establishing the apothecary as a distinct and regulated profession. Yet even as their identity became more formal, the heart of the apothecary's work remained the same. Listen to the patient. Understand the body. Use what the world offers to help. What was lost and what was gained. The shift from medieval apothecary to modern pharmacist brought many benefits: safety, regulation, and scientific rigor. But it also meant the loss of intimacy, the personal knowledge of a community's illnesses, the relationships built over years, the handwritten notes passed between generations. In the medieval apothecary's shop, medicine was both transactional and relational. A remedy was weighed not just in grams, but in hope, reputation, and belief. Today, as we sit in sterile clinics and tap prescriptions into apps, it's worth remembering what once was. A place where the ill came with faith, the healer responded with care, and the difference between cure and poison lay in the trembling hand of someone who had done this 100 times before. A final reflection. In the quiet corners of history, far from kings and wars, there were small rooms filled with jars, tools, and intention. The medieval apothecary didn't always succeed. Often, they didn't even understand what they were doing. But they tried. They listened, they learned, and they laid the foundation for something better. And perhaps the real question is, in an age where science governs healing, do we still leave space for the human hands that grind, measure, and offer not just treatment but presence? Story 8. Plague Time Remedies: How They Tried to Stop the Black Death. It began with a smell. A strange, sickly stench drifting through the streets, clinging to clothes, soaked into the walls. Then came the rumors, of ships arriving with dead sailors, of villages where everyone vanished. Then the fever, the swelling, the sudden death. And the silence. It was 1347 when the plague arrived in Europe, first through port cities like Genoa and Marseille, then spreading inland. By 1353, it had killed as many as 25 million people, 1/3 of Europe's population. Nothing in living memory had prepared them for this. And yet, in the face of terror, they tried to treat it. This is the story of how they tried to stop the Black Death with herbs and fire, superstition and science, desperation and hope. Understanding the plague with the wrong tools. Medieval physicians did not know about bacteria. They had no concept of Yersinia pestis, the pathogen we now know causes plague. The germ theory of disease was still centuries away. Instead, they believed in the miasma theory. Disease came from bad air or corrupt vapors rising from rotting matter. The humoral theory. Illness came from an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Astrology. Planetary alignments were often blamed, especially the rare triple conjunction of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn in 1345. Divine punishment. Many believed plague was a sign of God's anger, perhaps due to sin, war, or heresy. These beliefs shaped their treatments not because they were foolish, but because they had no better model. They built remedies not on science, but on tradition, observation, and fear. The plague doctor's outfit, fear and function. The image is iconic: a long dark robe, gloves, boots, and a beaked mask. Though often associated with the 14th century, this particular outfit became common later, especially during the 17th century's plague outbreaks. Still, it reflected genuine medieval practices and beliefs. The beak was filled with herbs like lavender, mint, cloves, and rose petals, camphor or vinegar-soaked sponges, dried flowers, especially posies or marigolds. These were meant to filter the air and protect the wearer from miasma. In earlier years, physicians wore layers of cloth soaked in vinegar, rose water, or herbal infusions. They sometimes carried pomanders, small metal balls filled with aromatic substances to sniff while walking through infected areas. The goal was simple: don't inhale the death. Common remedies, a mix of herbal hope and dangerous myths. Faced with a rapidly spreading, terrifying disease, people turned to what they knew and often to what they hoped might work. Herbal remedies and plague waters. Vinegar of the Four Thieves, a mix of rosemary, sage, lavender, thyme, and vinegar, supposedly created by thieves who robbed plague victims and remained healthy. Plague water, distilled infusions of herbs like angelica, rue, wormwood, and mint, sold by apothecaries or made at home. Garlic, consumed raw, mixed into broths, or worn in amulets. Many believed that these herbs could drive out the pestilence or purify the body. Some were steeped in white wine, boiled with honey, or distilled into potent tinctures. Fire, smoke, and fire. Burning sulfur, juniper branches, or resins inside homes to cleanse the air. Bonfires lit in public squares to purify entire neighborhoods. Families burned clothing and bedding of the sick, sometimes too late. In one tragic irony, plague sufferers were sometimes trapped in their homes, which were then set ablaze by neighbors in an attempt to stop the spread. Test tube bloodletting and buboes. Bloodletting was used to balance the humors. Some physicians lanced buboes, painful swellings in the lymph nodes, to let out the bad humors. Others cautioned against this, fearing it could worsen the infection. One method involved placing pigeon flesh or a live chicken over the swollen buboes, believing it could draw out the poison. Needless to say, these were not effective, but they were done out of desperation and sometimes with sincere compassion. Protective measures and quarantine. While medical treatments were largely ineffective, Some public health measures were surprisingly forward-thinking. Venice, in 1348, established the first quarantine station on an island, Lazaretto, where ships had to wait 40 days before docking, hence the term quaranta giorni. In many towns, guards were posted at city gates, and travel between villages was restricted. Infected houses were marked with red crosses, and sometimes sealed. Mass graves were dug outside towns to prevent further contamination. These strategies, though often brutal, helped slow the spread, though many towns acted too late. Religious responses, prayer, processions, and penance. Many people saw the plague as divine punishment and responded accordingly. Church bells rang continuously, calling the faithful to repentance. Public processions were held to beg for mercy, though these often spread the disease further. Flagellants, roving bands of men who whipped themselves in penance, traveled from town to town, preaching and performing acts of suffering. The church's role in healing was significant, especially through monasteries and confraternities that cared for the dying. But it was also spiritually fraught. Some priests fled, others died in droves trying to administer last rites. In some places, Jews and other minorities were blamed and massacred, accused of poisoning wells. These pogroms were not medicinal, they were panicked, violent scapegoating. What it meant to try. Despite all this, the failures, the myths, the chaos, there's something profoundly human in how medieval people faced the plague. They boiled herbs for their neighbors, lit fires in the hope of saving their towns, carried posies in pockets to guard their children, risked their lives caring for the sick, even when they knew they might die. And in those small acts, something enduring was born, the instinct to try, even when we don't understand. As we close this section, perhaps the deeper question is not why their cures failed, but what does it mean to care for others when you know you cannot save them? The plague was not only a crisis of the body, it was a crisis of belief, of commerce, of trust. When entire cities fell silent and the physicians disappeared, who did the people turn to? Who stepped into the void between suffering and salvation? The answer, in part, is that everyone did. From wandering preachers to con artists, from desperate parents to ruthless profiteers, plague-time Europe saw an explosion not only of illness, but of attempted cures, both sincere and sinister. Let's walk now through a continent on its knees and examine how fear created a marketplace of miracles. Holy remedies, relics, pilgrimage, and penance. When medicine failed, the soul became the next line of defense. Across Europe, people turned to religious remedies, believing the plague was sent by God, and thus only divine mercy could end it. Candle, relics, and saints. Relics of saints were paraded through cities, sometimes daily. Bits of bone, scraps of cloth, or splinters from the true cross were thought to purify the air and plead with heaven. Some claimed touching a relic could cure the infected. Pilgrims flocked to shrines, especially to saints known for healing or martyrdom by disease. Globe showing Europe, Africa pilgrimages. Even with quarantine restrictions, people embarked on pilgrimages to sacred sites. Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, Cologne. These journeys, often undertaken barefoot or in chains, were acts of repentance, but they also spread the plague further. Bell prayer and ritual. Towns held processions, some with thousands of participants, chanting and weeping in the streets. The Mass of the Holy Spirit, exorcisms and blessings became daily rituals. Public fasts were declared, and bells tolled not just for the dead, but for mercy. Faith was not a footnote in the treatment of the plague. It was often the only treatment available. Frauds and fakes, the dark trade of desperation. Where faith and fear rise together, opportunists are never far behind. Plague-time Europe was flooded with cures, elixirs, and proven remedies, some sincere, some deliberately deceptive. Test tube traveling charlatans. Wandering doctors sold miracle potions out of carts, often claiming foreign origins, from the East, by order of the Sultan, or learned in Egypt. These potions usually included strong alcohol, rosewater, and bitter herbs, sometimes mixed with opium or even gold dust. Sellers promised prevention, protection, or painless death, whatever people wanted to believe. Scroll magical amulets and spells. Sellers offered written charms, often in Latin or invented script, to be worn against the skin. Crystals, metal tokens, and engraved gemstones were sold as plague protection amulets blessed, they claimed, by bishops or ancient scholars. Nazar amulet counterfeit religious goods. Fake relics flooded the market. Fingernails of saints, splinters from Noah's Ark, hairs from the Virgin Mary's head. These objects were sold outside churches, at crossroads, or even door to door. Some believed, some didn't, but few could resist the thought, what if it works? Doctors who stayed and what they tried. While many physicians fled plague cities, some stayed behind. A few left us remarkable records of what they witnessed and what they tried. Guy de Chauliac, c. 1300–1368. A French physician and surgeon who remained in Avignon during the plague, even when Pope Clement VI retreated. He treated patients daily, noting that bubonic and pneumonic forms of the plague seemed distinct. He believed in contagion and quarantined himself, writing, "The plague frightened everyone so much that brother abandoned brother." Chauliac's writings provided one of the earliest medical observations of plague behavior, including notes on incubation periods and symptom progression. Thermometer treatments attempted. Rubbing the buboes with herbal poultices to draw out the poison. Applying cut onions, dried toads, or pigeon flesh to sores. Ingesting concoctions made from bezoar stones, crushed emeralds, or powdered unicorn horn, often fake. Prescribing strong purgatives to cleanse the body, or diuretics to flush it. Though largely ineffective, these attempts were grounded in the best available logic of the time, rooted in humoral theory, miasma, and careful observation. Communities in collapse and how they cared. As the death toll rose, towns and cities began to collapse under the weight of the plague. But even in breakdown, there were acts of care. Gravediggers and body collectors worked day and night, often without pay, to bury the dead. Religious orders, especially nuns, stayed behind to nurse the sick, knowing it meant their own deaths. Some towns organized food deliveries for infected households, placing bread and broth at their doors. Others established plague houses, rudimentary hospitals, or quarantine stations. These were not always acts of compassion. Sometimes they were pragmatic, but they helped preserve life where they could. In England, the city of Winchester attempted to isolate plague victims in nearby meadows. In Milan, infected homes were sealed shut, with food delivered through holes in the wall. Harsh, yes, but they marked the beginning of public health policy in Europe. The role of memory and the search for meaning. For those who survived, the plague left scars not only on the body, but on the mind. Some reacted with piety, others with hedonism, living wildly, believing death was always near. In the decades that followed, Europe saw a rise in charnel art and the dance of death motif, reminding people that death comes for all, rich and poor alike. Surge in plague chronicles, journals, and eyewitness accounts. Renewed interest in medical reform, sanitation, and the regulation of healers. The Black Death didn't only kill. It changed how people understood disease, organized cities, and valued life. Unanswered questions then and still today. Even now, centuries later, the Black Death remains partially mysterious. Why did it spare some regions and not others? Why did some survive when others perished within hours? Did certain herbal compounds offer real protective effects? Were asymptomatic carriers a factor, as they are in modern pandemics. And perhaps most haunting, what would we have done had we been there smelling the rot, hearing the bells, and facing a world unraveling before our eyes? The plague receded. Not suddenly, not completely, but the roar of death became a whisper. The carts stopped rolling through the streets. The mass graves were sealed. Bells rang again for marriages and not just burials. Europe emerged from the shadow of the Black Death, altered its people, its cities. Its ideas about health and healing forever changed. But what came next? What happened after the fevers and swellings were gone, when all that remained was silence, questions, and a desperate need to understand what had just happened? This final chapter explores how the plague reshaped the landscape of medicine, and how, paradoxically, the greatest failure in medieval healing led to a slow revolution in how humanity treated disease. The return to healing, but not to normal. As the death toll slowed, survivors returned to the world they barely recognized. Entire professions had vanished. Monasteries stood empty. Whole villages were gone. Medical practitioners, too, were decimated. Many physicians had died either from treating the sick or from fleeing and falling ill elsewhere. Monastic healers, especially nuns, were lost in high numbers, as they had been the ones to remain behind and care for plague victims. Apothecaries, surgeons, and even midwives filled the void, gradually taking on greater responsibility. This redistribution of care brought practical experience to the forefront. Those who had survived the plague and treated others gained something the universities had never taught: empirical knowledge. Changing attitudes, from humors to observation. Before the plague, European medicine was dominated by ancient Greek and Roman theory, especially the humoral system taught by Galen. But the Black Death undermined that certainty. How could an imbalance of fluids explain a disease that killed in hours? That spread to the healthy while sparing some of the sick. After the plague, a quiet intellectual shift began. Medical observation gained new respect. What doctors saw with their own eyes became more important than what was written in ancient texts. Interest grew in autopsies and anatomical dissection, especially in Italy. Cities like Bologna and Padua began hosting public dissections. New thinkers like Paracelsus, a 16th century physician influenced by plague theory, rejected Galenic doctrine, promoting chemical treatments over herbal ones and arguing that external agents, not just humors, caused disease. Though centuries would pass before germ theory, the plague cracked the foundation of ancient medical authority. Institutional reforms, the birth of public health. In the wake of the plague, governments began doing something new, taking direct responsibility for health. What started as desperate emergency measures, quarantines, travel bans, and sealed homes became lasting policies. Classical civic health boards. Cities like Venice, Milan, and Florence established plague boards, early public health councils. These bodies could enforce quarantines, hire plague doctors, regulate burial practices, order disinfection or burning of infected property. Hospital plague hospitals. Known as lazarettos, these isolated hospitals became permanent fixtures in many cities. Originally built for quarantine, some evolved into early epidemic treatment centers, prefiguring modern infectious disease wards. Scroll plague protocols. Cities kept written records of symptoms, survival rates, and household infections. These early plague registers laid the groundwork for medical statistics. The apothecary's rise. As faith in university medicine declined and monasteries emptied, apothecaries gained social importance. They were often the only consistent healthcare providers left. Their knowledge of herbs, distillation, and remedies, though imperfect, offered something tangible. Some began compiling herbals and materia medica in vernacular languages, making medical knowledge more widely accessible. In cities, their work became regulated. In rural areas, they remained trusted community healers. Their blending of science, tradition, and survival made them the bridge between old medicine and what was to come. A new view of death and disease. The plague didn't just alter medicine, it changed the psychology of a continent. Before the plague, death was part of life, yes, but not this kind of death. Not this scale, not this randomness. After the plague, people began to see death as ever-present, sudden, and indifferent to class or piety. Disease as mysterious, possibly preventable but never fully knowable. The body as something that might be studied, not just prayed over. Art reflected this, so did philosophy, so did medicine. In the wake of this horror, Europe began to think about disease not only as punishment, but as a problem to solve. Enduring superstitions and echoes of desperation. Not all ideas changed. Even long after the plague, many people still turned to amulets and talismans for protection, saints and relics for healing, quack cures sold in marketplaces, astrology now mixed with emerging chemical theories. Fear, after all, doesn't fade easily, especially when plague returned again in 1361, 1374, and almost every decade afterward for the next 300 years. Yet each time it came, societies were slightly better prepared. They responded faster, built better quarantines, and slowly began demanding more from their healers. A final reflection. The Black Death was not just a medical catastrophe, it was a human one, and in that darkness, the people of the Middle Ages showed resilience. They tried to understand, even when their theories failed, cared for others, even when it cost them everything, learned painfully that disease did not obey scripture or status. And perhaps the greatest lesson was this: when the world is gripped by fear, and the tools of healing are weak, the most important remedy is often the willingness to stand beside the suffering and try.